Hey, how
You
you
want to hear my
doing?
Javier song? Javier, Javier, it's Javier, 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 it's Javier. How you doing? What you thinking about? How's life?
So I mean, I don't know if you know, Thomas Jockin and I and Samuel Barnes, we've been reading St. Thomas Aquinas,
Amazing. Wow.
um, and we got into this distinction between intention and will.
Mm.
And so I thought it was very interesting that the way Thomas Jockin was describing the difference between will and intention, which intention is prior to will for Thomas Aquinas, apparently. That the way Jockin was describing it is like will is kind of like the algorithm, just kind of like gets imputed
Mm.
by the intention. Um, so in that sense, like the will is kind of blind. And then I was thinking about, because I know you've been thinking about free will, and I think it's really interesting because it seems like the way Aquinas understands will is it is this kind of like blind thing. Um, and yet the thing that gives it directionality is the intention.
Mm.
Right? What makes it good in itself is the intention towards that end. Um, so I don't know. I think that's really interesting that at least the way Jockin describes like the will is kind of like this blind algorithm per se. It'll just do what the direction gives, I
No,
guess.
that's fascinating. Well, that's wonderful. You're in a reading group with Barnes and Javier. Every time I read Aquinas, I'm always feel really stupid because I'm like, I
Right.
missed
Me
that.
too.
And I'm like, yeah, you're like, oh, that's right. I like, oh, let me just curl up in a ball. Dimitri, good to see you. It's really interesting you bring that up. So I'm still circling the topic of anger, and I really do think anger is a much deeper revelation than we realize.
Mm.
And I really do think anger is a revelation of, well, will. Like, because anger just seems to be the motivation of will. And I like this distinction because it gets at what I've been thinking about. Because when you're angry, don't you feel like something is coming through you? Like that there's this thing in you that just comes out, right? Well, that seems to be quote unquote will. Like, and the reason anger is so embedded in a breakdown of the social intelligibility is because it goes against your will. You don't want to lose the social intelligibility. And I wonder also if social intelligibility gives you a sense of where your will should go. Like your will is always going, okay? Like it's always there, but it's actually just like, Ebert and we all talk about the doorknob that works. Your will works when it just kind of flows. Like you don't think about it, right? Because it just kind of motivates you through the social intelligibility, the social relationships. You're always willing and it's always kind of just working, right? What ends up happening when social intelligibility breaks, it's like the doorknob breaks in Heidegger and you see it, right? So your will is the thing swimming you through almost social relationability or the external world. And then when it breaks, it becomes visible. You see your will and you see it in its break. And so it doesn't know where to go. So it feels pinned down and it's like a mouse in a corner and it panics almost. It gets angry, right? Because that's what it feels like. It feels like there's this thing that was going and it hit and then it became visible and it's pinned down. And so it panics, right? And that energy, and I'm also like I was speaking with Michael, and Slaughterdyke talks about this. Owen talks about this, who, at Schizo FM. Owen, I love Owen. His book, Defenseology, is tremendous. Slaughterdyke talks about a psychoanalysis of anger, not just a psychoanalysis of desire. Now, obviously, these things overlap, desire and anger. But like when you really, really look at the experience of anger, it does seem to be this thing like will. Mr. Jockin, good to see you. Oh, that's perfect. Javier just brought up the distinction between intention and will. So I'm really fascinated by that in Aquinas. And I do think it ties to this question of like we've been talking about on anger, because I'm still fascinated by that, where anger and will seem to go together. And will seems to be this thing like that's just flowing through you, through your day. And when social intelligibility breaks down, will becomes visible like a broken doorknob. It doesn't know where to go because it doesn't know where to flow. It's like energy or water that doesn't know where to go. It's like water in a river that doesn't, and it flows out. And because it's like a mouse in a corner pinned down, it panics, right? There's something about anger being like a panicking will, right? And it's almost, well, that's interesting. What if anger emerges where intention and will are separated? Like, what if like anger is where you don't know where to intend the will, and so the will's still going, but you don't know how to intend it, right? Maybe that's part of it, because that relationship, because you're like, it does seem that will has this flow characteristic and it needs to be directed by intention. Maybe anger is where you don't know where to intend the will. And that seems true, because when there's, and I'll give it to you, Mr. Jockin, when there's a social breakdown, what do people say? They don't know what to do. They don't know what to do, right? And so there's a breakdown. So the intention and the will get separated, and that's experienced as anger. But also, I was making a distinction last night with Michael between anger care and anger hate, because I think those are different. There's a quality of anger that's care, and there's a quality of anger that's hate. So it's almost like anger hyphen care, anger hyphen hate. And when you anger care, you care to know where the intention is, but you don't know where it is, so you're frustrated and things start blowing up, right? So there's Michael now, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir.
Good to see everybody. Good point, actually. This is interesting. So yeah, because me and Javier are part of a reading group for Aquinas, and we're talking through for him the importance of there's a hierarchy relationship kind of circles back on itself of the intention, the will, the act, and the object. So the very fact that intention and object are separated, it's kind of fleshing out a little bit of what you're saying, Daniel. I think especially talking about this kind of social anger, right? So it's not even necessarily about individuals. It's about based on sometimes aggregations or larger groups. I think that's a kind of like almost fight or flight, right? Isn't that interesting? That kind of language. I immediately thought of like a fight or flight instincts or reactions. And the key thing is that a lot of times that fight or flight instinct is kicking in without intention, like without operation of the intellect. This is a biological parameter. It's not a cognitive operation, a normal cognitive sense we're thinking about. So I think that makes a lot of sense the way you're talking about it, Daniel. I think that idea of anger, of hate versus care, because that's one of the main distinctions, right? Plato's always said that you can never will the evil for oneself, right? You always are desiring the good, or always chasing away from, you're running away from harming you. But as I think I've said to other groups and other people, or I said in this group, you can absolutely will the destruction of someone else or something else. That's a very interesting part, because usually the traditional stance of anger is that it's normally a sign of affliction onto oneself. So first there's anger because some pain has happened to you by something you love or care about. But what you're bringing up, Daniel, is that other side, is that anger brought up when a harm is done and you're wishing the destruction, kind of an acting out operation. So I think it's important. I think Aquinas' language, which borrowed from the Arab schools, from Avicenna, for example, of intention, will, act, and object, that 4-part distinction is quite useful to help articulate what anger is. I think it's a good starting point. So I'll stop there.
No, delightful, Michael. Good to see you. I was just talking about our conversation
Last night, and Javier and Thomas were talking about from the Aquinas reading group this distinction between will and intention, and how will has this certain sort of, we were talking about it as a psychoanalysis of anger. We're talking about will as this kind of motivation, and it does feel like there's this kind of motivation, and intention is the direction of that intention. And in an act of anger, it's as if the will that's always flowing encounters a break, like a broken doorknob in Heidegger, thus becomes visible. But because it's in the context of broken social relations, you don't know what direction to intend it in. You don't know where to flow it. And so there's a frustration, and you care to figure out where to go. So you care. You want to know how to intend the energy and the will, but you don't know how, and that creates this boom kind of thing, right? And we also were talking about, as you brought up, the distinction between anger, care, and anger, hate, and with that little hyphen, and that's a very useful distinction. And I definitely think like there's something in the moment of anger that's a revelation of something that is always present. And I'll give it to Javier. A metaphor I often use in my writing is the idea that there are 2 rivers, and they combine together, and then they separate. But when they combine together, there's still 2 rivers, but you can't tell because they've merged. And it's not until the break that you can see the separation. I think a lot of the most important topics of philosophy are like that. They're separate things, but maybe 98% of the time they're merged. So they seem like one river, but then they split again and you see they're actually 2, right? And I wonder if anger is a moment of the river splitting between will and intention, where will and intention are practically always together because you're intending the direction of will. So practically will and intention are similes, but technically they're not. But it's in these moments of break that you can see the distinction, that it becomes more vivid to you. And maybe anger is an example of that kind of break. I actually bring that together with the free will decision because, 90% of the time, there really isn't a meaningful distinction between freedom and causation, because you're just going with the cause and effect, right? But it's in the moment when someone asks you to do something you don't want to do, there can be a split. You can see the difference between freedom and determination, free will. But the funny thing is, of course, that means freedom becomes most vivid precisely in moments of denial. Like it's in the moments where someone asks you not to do something and you feel the desire not to do it, which is precisely when you often feel less free. Those are the times where you feel less free are paradoxically the moments when it becomes most vivid, that there's a distinction between freedom and causation, which then, since you don't experience that as freedom, but as anxiety, you interpret not as evidence of free will, but the fact that you don't have it because someone's asking you to do something you don't want to do. So there's a kind of irony there. And I wonder if that is at play with the question of will and intention and anger and so on. But let me give it to Javier. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I do, yeah, I was definitely on the same line of thought you were when you brought up like maybe anger is that kind of split between will and intention. Because Jockin sort of showed us this like very schizophrenic graph from Aquinas, where the will affects so many parts of our cognition. So like our memory, our imagination. And I'm just thinking like, yeah, that has to be the will, because when you're angry, like the very trope style anger is just like you're thinking about what you're going to do next, or you're imagining, or you're replaying the event in your head, right? And so that affects your memory about how you recall the event. That can actually get you more angry if you recall it in a very specific way. And then after that, you're imagining what you will do next, right? Am I going to get revenge? Am I going to hit him? Am I going to do something maybe more passive aggressive? So I think it's really interesting that the will sort of swallows up all these areas. And then, then it's like the intention. And this is like what's interesting, because I think when the will is that taken over, it's very hard for me to think about my intention at that point. But I know specifically, for example, in this distinction that you made with Michael, with anger care. Anger care is more easy for me to see the split between intention and will, because it's very clear to me that I love the person, so I don't want to hurt them. But the problem is that I'm angry, and so I myself am hurting. I myself am suffering. So how do I express this anger without causing harm? That's essentially the predicament that you run into in like very personal relationships, I would say, very intimate relationships, where you don't want to hurt them, but you also have to admit a kind of humility with you being hurt and offended. So I think for me, the intention and will split becomes more clear. I'm trying to think through this other, notion of anger, hate, where it seems maybe the reason why the intention is a little bit more silent is because you already hate them. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, it's almost like an anger hate. You give your intention
Over to the anger. Like you just you give up intention in a way. Whereas in anger care, you're still trying to have the intention toward the care. Kind of to have the anger filtered through the care. Whereas in anger hate, you're like, screw it, I ain't filtering it at all. In fact, it's so maybe it's like where the rivers merge negatively almost, like in anger hate. It's where you let them merge, and in fact they merge, and maybe the intention becomes the flow. It just is the flow. Just let the anger flow, right? Because it is interesting. Like there's a quality of anger hate Well, where you don't hold yourself back. That's what it feels like. Whereas in anger care, it feels like you're trying to hold yourself back but can't. And that's kind of interesting, right? Like in that wonderful discussion Michael was having with Aspasia on this idea of there's this anxiety pushing down, anxiety about anger, and anger is pushing up. I wonder what ends up happening. And I wonder if in a world where we can't see anger care, then the only way we can push the anger down is with anxiety, but that's a counterfeit of care, actually. Like really it should be the care that's trying to master the anger. And if we don't see care and anger, then it becomes anxiety, which tries to repress, not master. Maybe that's the difference. Where in anger, the anger care moment, there's some effort of the care to master the anger, right? And you're fighting it, but the anger can't help but come out. Of course it can't. You haven't mastered it yet. Like, of course some anger is going to come out. You haven't mastered it yet. And in fact, it kind of has to come out just like how do you have a masterful wrestler without the wrestling match, right? Like you have to have the dancer in the dance. Of course there's anger in the anger care. That is the thing in the act of the mastery, right? So it's there, but the fact that it's there is not inherently bad. And then I'll give it to Michael. But if we don't have anger care because we're not allowed to think of it, then we settle for a counterfeit of anger anxiety, which tries to repress but not master. And then that leads to all sorts of trouble. So it's interesting because, well, then care is a kind of intention about anger. It's an intention about the moments where intention and will break. Where anxiety is also an intention. Well, it's more like an intention, but it's the wrong kind of intention. It's an intention of, and it doesn't work, right? But it's interesting because care is supposed to be the intention you have for the moment where the will and the intention break, right? And it works to master it. So that's interesting. But let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please. It's good to see you. I enjoyed speaking last night.
Yes, it was a wonderful discussion. Yeah, I wanted to pick up on this idea of the interplay between care and anger, and like, because one thing that I was working with last night in our discussion is like, what are the mechanistic differences that allows for the disparity between anger care and anger hatred? And so, like, if we can understand that, like, we can kind of understand more how to like incentivize anger care and, like, you know, understand when the threat for anger hatred can arise and like kind of prevent that. And I think it is this sense of like, if there's this element of care like undergirding your anger, then it's channeled towards virtuosity. Like there's kind of always that like directionality to it of like, I'm feeling angry because there's a way in which like what I truly want, which is connectivity and authenticity, whatever it might be, like is not being met. And so like by me expressing my anger, I'm expressing my desire for, you know, this relationship, this business venture, like whatever it might be, to move to that direction. And it's kind of like, you know, in like a systems theory way, it's like the fuel that is required to enact like a second order change to create a new homeostasis kind of thing. And then, yeah, and then, you know, like just picking up on something Michelle was putting in the comment section, which is like the kind of flow from anger that feels helpless and that kind of like breeding a sort of powerlessness, nihilism into a depression. Like, I think that's when anxiety has like kind of co-opted and corrupted the state of anger. And then it feels less like a state, which is something that is by its very nature impermanent, like every other emotion, into like a belief system. And then that's where, you know, one person's anger can fuel an entire movement based on anger and hatred. And, you know, we were talking about yesterday with like scapegoating, which is like a pattern that it seems like a lot of people have when they get angry. Is like they become really self-righteous, and then they're like, you made me angry and you're this type of person, and like now this is like a story that I'm telling myself And it's a very powerful one. And it's like we were talking about with like, themos and like motivation and desire, like people can really be galvanized by an anger scapegoat, and it can like coordinate. I mean, it can coordinate like entire, multinational like movements. And I think, in the US right now, like there's a response. I mean, with the election, like I think is a response to just a failure of institutions, and like there's a lot of anger. And then, with this like healthcare CEO that got assassinated, there's like now all these conversations surrounding that and people supporting him because of how furious they are about the healthcare system and things like that. And so it seems like, and what you were talking about, Daniel, with threat and mastery, I think is so spot on and so brilliant, because I think once you're oriented around mastery, there's a built-in humility there that I think is like it seems like the best antidote to being overcome by hatred is a humility, because like hatred is inherent to it is this sense of pride of like, and this kind of moral superiority. And so like an anger that is like underpinned by care, I think is still able to recognize the humanity in the other, and also recognize that the anger that I'm feeling, like I remember Javier like a week or two ago was like, I realize after almost every time that I'm angry that I was wrong, or that like like I had like an incomplete idea of like what I was angry about. And I think is having that virtue present in anger seems to be the answer to channeling it in the right way. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
No, magnificent. And Clayton, Jason, it is wonderful to see
You both. We are talking about anger, the phenomenology of anger, difference between anger care and anger hate, ideas of the difference from Aquinas between intention and will, and how these things seem to be related. And I really like what you just said. There is something, well, it's interesting because like if you go into anger, it's really helpful if when you feel anger and it comes over you, if you're like one of your first thoughts is, there's probably something I don't see. There's a humility there that makes you, Aspasia was talking about just acknowledging the anger and kind of seeing it, how that's almost like a superpower where you identify with the determination, but you get that allows a certain mastery of it versus being lost in it. The moment you say there's probably something I don't see, like some break in the social field, that moves you into a certain humility that's also looking for the core, which is the truth of the anger, which means you're actually in a way treating the anger with care. So anger care has a way of treating the very anger with care to figure out the core of it. So that's a very interesting difference. I guess the other thing I'm just kind of thinking about, because we mentioned Aquinas, and then we'll give it to Javier, there's something about, anger is sometimes being just, right? Like this idea of justice and anger and the social field, and it's wrong, right? Well, what is something from, classical thought that is a result of justice is teleological, when the ends are being met, when things are moving toward their end, right? Well, it's interesting because in anger, I love you, Dimitri. Good to see you, sir. Yeah, I know. It's overwhelming with the social field. But there's something where in anger, you feel like the telos has been denied. You're not moving toward the telos anymore. You're not moving toward the end. The social field has been broken. We're not moving toward the telos. Therefore, it's unjust. This relationship is supposed to be moving toward love, and it feels like it's not. And so it's interesting to think if there's something teleological in the anger, and the reason why the anger feels justified is because it feels, well, you're denying the end. Injustice is found when things are moving toward their end. And if the end is denied, that's injustice, right? And so there's actually, in anger, being a recognition of some sort of movement of the will being denied. It's stuck. Well, the will's no longer teleological. The social field is gone, so it can't flow. So it feels like an injustice because it feels like a denial of the telos, right? It feels like the final cause has been broken. And so that's why, why it's so dangerous to say, because like Aspasia was bringing up, and I'll give it to Javier, there's this danger in saying anger is always bad. Why? Well, because you could throw away the telos and throwing away the anger, right? You can throw away the end, and if you throw away the telos, you can't move, and you've thrown away justice, right? But you see, the key is anger care seems to be in service continually of the telos and the justice, where anger hatred, maybe anger hatred is where you say, screw it, I'm just moving, I don't care what the telos is, I'm just flowing now. Like it's movement without telos, maybe. Like, because you just don't care. Like, anger hate is just pure flow, movement, so ergo chaos. Because what is chaos? Chaos is movement without telos, right? Like, chaos is a movement that doesn't have a telos. It doesn't have a final cause. It's just pure movement. And maybe that's what anger hate is. Anger hate with the hyphen is movement, will, without telos, because what is intention? Intention is always teleological. It is always toward something, right? So anger hate as will without intention would be unteleological, and therefore it's neither just or unjust, it's given up on justice. That's why you're doomed. At least when you're operating in anger care, it's like injustice and justice. Well, you're still in the categories of injustice and justice. They're still meaningful, right? And you're navigating them. In anger hate, you've given up. You're like, there is no justice. It's like Hecuba saying nothing is trustable. You know, the horizon of the possibility of justice is gone. So maybe that's what happens in anger hate. It becomes will and movement without teleologically, and therefore the terms of justice no longer apply, and therefore there's a kind of damnation, where in anger care, there's a desire of intention to become teleological again. And the reason why when will and intention come in conflict, it's a denial of the teleology, the telos. And if it's a denial of that, then it feels like what? Injustice. Because that's exactly what we learn in classical thought. If it doesn't align with the end, then it loses the justness, right? And it's almost like it's all one giant emotional testament to the reality of these metaphysical schemas that we see in these thinkers, right? That's live. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
You know, when I was telling Jockin about this, where I was like, Aquinas' idea of the good is so heavy to do. It's because it's like fourfold, basically, and it has to be complete goodness. And he says, it's not fully good if there's one single defect of sin, which I think is so significant. But I think the discrepancy here that you're pointing out, Daniel, is interesting, because anger care, and Aquinas talks about obstacles when trying to pursue the end, right? Anger care could be the fact that one is caring enough to distinguish between good itself and the apparent good. And I think that's very significant, because that would put you in a state of humility. Because basically what it's positioning you in this sense of, okay, so this obstacle can be interpreted in multiple ways. It can be interpreted as the thing that interrupts my end, or it can be the revelation that actually my anger is directed to what I think is an apparent good. That could be one thing to determine between apparent good and good itself. And I think that's what caring would actually be like, to care about your anger, or maybe righteous anger is this heavy distinction between apparent good and goodness itself. I'm going to read a little bit from like what the Dalai Lama says here about anger and hatred, which I thought is interesting. It says, for the Dalai Lama, hatred can have no virtue. It only eats the person from within and poisons his or her interactions with fellow human beings. In his words, hatred is the true enemy. It is the inner enemy. Perhaps we can say that the feature that distinguishes anger and hatred is the absence or presence of ill will. So it already seems to say that the presence of ill will definitely seems to correspond with what we're saying with hatred, which means to say that the person has already decided intentionally to direct their will with a certain end. Whereas by caring for our anger, we put this question mark, it would seem. Are we running into an apparent good or goodness itself? And that's the investigation. That's what we need to refrain from discovering. I'll leave it there.
No, I really like. I'll give it to Mr. Jock because there is something when
Will like doesn't know where to go. Like the intention and will are broke, right? Well, what does that mean? I don't know what the apparent good is and what is the real good. You're stuck and you're having to figure it out. Oh, and it's your partner that has to help you figure it out. That's why this happened. So you need to like talk with them precisely when you don't want to talk with them because you're mad, right? Like that's really interesting because, well, again, there's always this idea of I, otherness. The only way to kind of like figure things out is in relation. Like if you close off, all you do is close in. It's interesting because it's precisely in the moment where intention and anger break, where you can't tell the difference between apparent good and actual good, that you need to open up to the other person that you're closed off with. So then maybe the anger is also a feeling of moving toward damnation. Like, because you're moving toward the closure. In the very act of anger, you're breaking away from that which you need to move you back into the social intelligibility. So there's like a twofold action going on, right? It's like a lot of revelations all at once. It's like, I don't know the difference between apparent good and actual good, and I thought I did, and now I feel this thing that's bubbling up inside of me, and I don't even know where to direct it. So then there's a difference between intention and will. Oh my gosh, there's a difference between actuality and appearance, and there's a difference between an intention and will, and now I'm even heading towards something I can't escape. It's like all of these kind of revelations that are happening all at the once, every single one of them, which is metaphysically weighty, and you never think about metaphysics. And I just wanted to watch Netflix. Why are we having to have a revelation on the nature of reality all at once? Dang it. And the very fact, that kind of trauma of metaphysical threefold relationship, like revelation, happening all at once, which is a kind of trauma, has a certain overwhelming that then makes you want to withdraw. So you don't have to experience that all at once, right? But then this is where perhaps the original of apocalypse, that's beautiful. Yeah, there's a certain apocalypse in anger. Absolutely. Like the anger and apocalypse kind of go together as revelation and destruction. That's a beautiful association, Jason. And it's interesting because if there is something about philosophy, as we've talked about before, and I'll give it to Jockin, if there's something about philosophy, which is the training of natural mental immunity, because we've talked about natural immunity and you have to do things, we talked with Michelle and different things, there's something about philosophy that has a certain training of your natural mental immunity and your natural emotional immunity. Well, what are you doing in philosophy? You're often kind of just getting used to, more often habitat, certain metaphysical revelations and distinctions between will and intention and distinctions between appearance and actuality. And you're just kind of getting used to it. So that then when you have the anger experience, you have familiarity with those distinctions so they don't overwhelm you. But if you don't have any familiarity with you and you run into this situation where you're experiencing differences between actuality and appearance and may not even have the language to say it, like you just intuit that separation, well, then it's really frustrating because you're having like revelations of distinctions you didn't even know were there and revelations that you don't have the language to even word it. And so it just, boom, it like really erupts. And so that's really, really interesting. And then worse yet, in that state of all these things like happening, there's a sense of justice being denied in the background of it all. A teleological snap. So that just supercharges it, right? And so then it's bad. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Yeah, I think we did a good job kind of fleshing out a lot of the dimensions about it. I think that's kind of the key, right? So I've noticed this has been like a multi-saga episode at the discussion of anger. And I think one of the things you realize is basically the whole point, as you just said, Daniel, is that without philosophical training, you have no idea that these things are operating on you. And you just present it. It's like a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional object that's just like compounding it at a moment you didn't anticipate. I said it before, the idea of the anthenemy. Basically, we're run by anthenemies. We have all these unspoken first premises that we operate on, which relate to basically that object of desire, right? Or objects of desire are predicated on a lot of times unstated things we take for granted, that when we get the injury of some withdrawal from it, that's where anger starts to energize up. Aquinas basically talked about anger as the daughter, basically of many other evils, basically, mostly because it's said, like in the distinction Aquinas makes, is that he uses reason to say that anger is not a problem. It's from the irascible appetite, which, by the way, is the desire for metaphysical goods. That's exactly the key about it, Daniel. That's why your notion about metaphysical revelation related to the emotion of anger is not unfounded from Aquinas because of that point. The irascible appetite responds to those qualities. So when that happens, there's the inward conception, the outward sign, and the breaking out. I like that language from Aquinas, the breaking out of the effect. That when anger is operated on this channel of intention, and I said to the reading group, the will, it's an algorithm. It's gonna do what it wants to do. It just follows the protocol. So once it starts going, you start seeing signs of it starting to process. And that's via a lot of times, and as Javier said, it's on one of the major distinctional notes is that issue of is the anger from a withdrawn good for oneself, that one desire to good and was withdrawn or taken away. Actually, one note about that related to thumos is the indignation. So indignation is one of those senses of status. So it's a status removal. You're not being treated in a way you expect to be treated. That's an example of phenamine, kind of like I'm a certain person and you are another kind of person. There's an expectation of how to be communicated to or responded to or treated that you're not getting. So that's that's mode of it. So that's necessarily one could make an argument that being ill will or not. It's certainly pride. It's basically very dangerously close to pride, very close, because it's basically saying I'm a higher status than you, and you're not treating me the way to be expected. But there's a nuance to that because this all comes down, for example, a parent-child dynamic or teacher-student. For example, like I've seen memes where like high school students come and actually address their teachers by their first name and look for the reaction in the video. So these are examples of almost indignation responses, and they're angry. Some of the teachers get very angry about it. And that's part of the reason why there's a violation of really expectation of relationship between the two. And I think that you're kind of breaking through with those other aspects. So like, and I think actually related to like the emotional overwhelm people get is that swelling of the mind. Aquinas has a language to talk about that. So this is an example where, again, like the anger is on this, it can be dangerous because of those effects. It basically just distorts, it causes a distortion of all what you're perceiving. And you can't see things straight because your mind is all swelled up and all amok from there. So I think from these notes I'm picking up from it, right? So there's a kind of like the sophisticated nuance about, and again, notice that your body's emotions is a trigger of something much more significant than what you think is being stated or being presented in front of you. That's what makes anger very interesting as a phenomenon, right? In terms of this, I've always seen this, look for examples when the soul and the body is a kind of measurement tool, as an instrument to kind of pick up on reality. And anger is actually one of those cases, but like any instrument, instrument is complex as Javier pointed out. The human subject is an incredibly complicated instrument that has multiple kind of secondary effects inside the soul and in the body that basically can be all mucked up for different reasons and cannot necessarily be always reliable. But it makes a very interesting phenomenon, just observation. So it's been fun to talk about this.
No, delightful. Well, so I'm very interested, again, kind of as we've been saying, it seems to me as if the phenomenology of emotions can be metaphysical proofs. And like in the, not logical proofs, not like 2 + 2 = 4, therefore, but there's something about really paying attention to the experience of emotion and then asking, what are the conditions of possibility that must be there for this emotion to occur? Because phenomenology is always asking, what must the conditions be for this to occur? That then suggests a metaphysical, that function therefore is a metaphysical proof. And if you think about it, basically that's how I take Zizek with Lacan and Hegel, right? He's like, hey, if there's something about desire that functions by a lost object, if our emotion of a desire or desire, like if want in these things function necessarily by a lack, maybe, and we experience that, one, what does that say about the conditions of subjectivity that afford this? And two, what must the nature of reality be like? So this is even a possibility. So from a emotional desire experience and analysis of how that occurs, you move toward a posturing of what, well, the nature of being might be, to use a grand phrase, right? And it's very different from simply basing it on non-contingent speculations or mathematics or something. But of course, you could do a similar thing by simply asking what kind of being must a human do to be able to think math, right? But notice what's interesting is you're using the phenomenology of the thing to suggest something broader beyond subjectivity that is only possible because of subjectivity, right? That's kind of the weird move, right? Well, emotions seem to have a unique might have a unique posturing of saying something about what is metaphysically the case, precisely because they are possible because of the existence of the subject, and yet often are in conflict with the subject at the same time. And it is in those ruptures that you have a kind of glimmer of the apocalypse, and then it goes away. A glimmer, gone. Glimmer, gone. Like anger wouldn't exist if there wasn't subjectivity. So you say, oh, it's just subjective, right? Well, what's interesting is anger seems to like take over the subject. So it is a way the subject comes in a kind of conflict with itself that maybe like provides a glimmer or a certain rupture or a certain opening that suggests something that the subject must be participating in so that it can become conflict in itself, right? Like the phenomenological question, substance subject, exactly, from Hegel. So the question would be, okay, in anger, the subject seems to kind of in a way come into conflict with itself or not know what to do with itself. So what must the conditions of possibility be so that the subject can so come into conflict with itself, right? What must the conditions of possibility be so that will and intention can be a distinction and meaningfully a distinction, right? One can imagine a possible universe where where will and intention don't have a meaningful distinction, possibly, right? Or maybe we do modal logic and say, Kripke, that there's no such will, but you get the point, right? If we are in a world where based on phenomenological experience, it seems meaningful to say there is a distinction between will and intention, then what must the conditions of possibility be in the universe so that that distinction is meaningful, right? And there would be then proof to think that there is a meaningful distinction by the very emotional experience of the subject themselves, right? Your very subjective experience that is a conflict of the subject would give you reason to think there is a difference, which means the universe must be a place where that difference is possible. Therefore, one moves from a certain phenomenology to a metaphysic, right? And so that's where the phenomenology of emotions as metaphysical proofs seems to be very, very useful. I'm also very, and then anyone who wants to speak, please. I'm also very interested by this difference. One, I was, as a wordplay, I was thinking like libido, desire, and then will, and I'm now like thinking like willow. And you know, trees are kind of like willowy, like willow, and they like windy. And anger, like the will is like that. It's like the wind. It comes and goes, right? Like a willow tree, or they're pretty, so I just wanted to bring that in. So it's like willow, the version of libido, maybe, but it has a wind-like quality, right? So there's something like coming and goes. So maybe we're talking about the psychoanalysis of Willow, right? Also, that's a really, really weird Disney movie from a really long time ago. But anyway, I'm also really taken. What is the difference between expectation and telos? Do you have an expectation if you have a telos, right? Because this seems very interesting because there's a way in which we're suggesting expectation can be problematic, right? Where it can be thrown off. We see this in anger all the time. I had an expectation you wouldn't lie to me. That seems reasonable. Okay, that seems to not really be a problematic expectation. That seems to be more like teleological, actually, because a relationship is that in which people don't lie, right? But then there's where you say, I expected you not to leave the salt on the table. That's not really teleological. That's just kind of preferential. You're just kind of being picky now, right? But it's like, but relationships have expectations, and expectations are good. Well, no, you're just being like difficult, right? Okay, so what's the difference between an expectation in the relationship for people not to leave salt on the table and the expectation for them not to lie, right? I think it's teleological, right? Like a relationship, if you are in a relationship, a relationship is a thing in which people do not lie, right? And so, to me, another reason why teleology here is so important is because otherwise you can't make meaningful differences between just expectation and false expectation, right? And how many relationships, and I'll give it to Javier, Michael, and Thomas, how many relationships are obliterated because people aren't able to tell the difference between apparent expectation and good expectation, bad expectation, right? It's all freaking teleological, which then, again, to go back to what I was saying, the very fact that the inability, the practical emotional consequences of not knowing the difference between good expectation and bad expectation, if you grant me that language, thus leads to all sorts of trouble, would suggest that reality is a place where that expectation is good, and if you don't have it, you have trouble, which would suggest that the conditions of possibility of reality are such that are teleological, right? If the inability to make this distinction leads to all sorts of frickin' trouble, well, maybe reality is in fact teleological, because the only way you can deal with this problem is through teleology. Otherwise, you're lost forever, unable to tell the difference between the expectation that makes you a dick and the expectation that's reasonable, right? If you literally in your emotional life can't make that distinction and are screwed because you can't make it, maybe that's because reality is something fundamentally teleological. But let me give it to Mr. Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I mean, this is really good. This is a really important point because, like, in my experience of the salt metaphor, right? People can interpret this as, oh, so if you don't do that for me, then you don't care about me. You don't, you don't respect me. You don't care about my boundaries. Um, and that, and I've always been like, boundaries is such a problematic word because it's like, so what are we talking about when we mean by boundaries? Like, is it a way to simply prevent yourself from ever encountering any uncomfortability, any anxiety? So I mean, when your partner breaks these expectations, they're breaking the boundaries, so then you have room to condemn them and confront them, point out how, imperfect they are. So yeah, I mean, I think this is why we had to talk about virtue in relationships. But then I guess like there can be a kind of tangling in with virtue and like preferences maybe. I can give an example of just like I like doing the dishes, right? Um, I would prefer you to do the dishes when I'm working, right? So that way I don't have to do them when I come home. But the virtue aspect isn't in doing the dishes. It's in the fact that you already preemptively agreed as a couple to basically teamwork together, work together. So there's a kind of fidelity commitment to this idea. Now I think this is where people get meshed up in, is they take the apparent good, doing the dishes, as the full revelation of your lack of virtue. When in reality, it could be more like, hey, I got sidetracked. I forgot to do it today. I'm still committed to doing this kind of thing, right? Because the other aspect of virtue is also like forgiveness, right? Like mercy and like all these other kind of like avenues. So it's this reminder of what is the end goal here. The end goal isn't that you're supposed to just do the dishes. The end goal is that we're committed to each other to help each other out. And sometimes we fail and sometimes, we succeed or whatever. But the main point is to help each other reach that end, right? And then also kind of be there when the other person wasn't there to reach that end. So it's very interesting to me how this can get muddled up for couples because, like, again, if you're having a bad day, like, yeah, I'm going to rage at my partner for not doing the dishes or whatever because they hate coming home to dirty dishes or whatever, right? But you can kind of forget the end, right? That the actual end of that kind of thing. The end was helping each other out, right? This kind of commitment of not making things overwhelming for each other. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, this is fascinating. I'll give it to Michael and Mr. Jockin. And so first, and then that was some excellent comments from Clayton. Expectation, Jason, building of the building, not. So I agree that the language of boundaries is very problematic because it does not make clear the telos, and if it doesn't ask the question if the boundaries are good or not. They're gonna feel good because you're pissed, but are they good, right? Like it's almost like really what you want is riverbank. Like you need riverbanks for the flow of the will, right? Like the problem with a boundary is hit wall, hit wall, hit, and that's like how a lot of people's relationships are, right? I set boundaries and you people just keep hitting them, and our relationship is just hitting each other's boundaries and being angry. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, I think we can do better. And I think if we think about riverbank, like you need riverbanks, because if there are not riverbanks, the river can't flow and in fact may flood, right? Like, so there's something about riverbanks or channels That's it. Now, F that. We're going to put up some walls, dang it. Bring it. So, you know, there's something about, to me, when I hear boundaries, it is a metaphor that is suburban. It is, I have my private property, you have your private property, get off my lawn. Whereas really, when you're talking a relationship, you're talking about some sort of channeling, right? It's not really a get off my lawn. It's flow. It's more like riverbanks. What are the riverbanks that we need to stay in a state of flow? What are the riverbanks that we need to be in self-forgetfulness? Hey, when you do this, the water floods. The water like comes out of the river. The flow dies, right? That seems, or when you do that, you're building a dam or something, right? Like, it's very interesting because what's the difference between a boundary and a dam? The reason metaphors must take into account the ontology of the thing for which they are a metaphor. So what is a relationship like? Is a relationship like a yard, or is a relationship like a flow? If it's like a flow, the metaphor you want to use is something more like riverbanks, and boundaries are probably just dams. And dams are dangerous. They can cause flooding, right? So to me, the art of metaphor must... The problem is people make metaphors without asking ontological and teleological questions. Metaphors can give a false impression of the teleology. A metaphor, if done poorly, gives a false impression of the ontology. And of course, if you have a false impression of the thing you're doing, what do you end up in? Privation, appearances, not actuality, and thus trouble. A bad metaphor can contribute to privation. And thus all sorts of pathology, right? And I think people who create metaphors who are trying to be helpful, because everyone in relationships, generally, if they care, try to be helpful, but help isn't always helpful and actually can make things worse. People create metaphors trying to be helpful that are not ontologically sophisticated and therefore create unintentional consequences. And I think boundaries is one of those because it is a suburban metaphor that speaks to private property and unfortunately suggests a relationship is the building of a middle-class lifestyle that gets retirement at 60s, and how do we sustain ourselves to that? Well, yeah, boundaries can do it, but you might be bored. Boundaries and boredom tend to go together, right? And a lack of passion. So I think it's much better to think in terms of riverbeds. I think also on this massive question of the telos and the creative. So what's I'll give it to Michael, Thomas, Mr. Jockin, and Michelle. What is the telos of a relationship is almost like asking, without trying to be heretical, what is the telos of God? Like, what is God's telos? Well, being God, right? Okay, well, what is God? Ooh, God, right? You can't, you're stuck. But if you grant me this, is there not something about God that is necessarily alive, active, creative? Like, I think it's quite fair to say that God is not a stagnant entity, that there is something about God that is very irreducible, very creative, very flowing, very beautiful, right? Well, if a relationship, love, if we, Chris, God is love, love is love. So the telos of a relationship needs to be creativity. It needs to be, the very telos of a relationship is ever building. Well, wait. How do you have an end that is ever building? That only makes sense if you're thinking eternity. What is the telos of eternity? Itself to itself. An ever unfolding, an ever dynamic, alive unfolding. One of the problems we have is when we think about relationships, we bring with it a teleological structure that is conditioned by the telos of objects. What is the telos of a coffee cup? To get coffee. What is the telos of a boat? To be in the river. What is the telos of a relationship? The answer will not be like the first two, because a relationship is a meta-geometrical situation that is more like eternity than space-time, if you will. It is more like, so the point of a relationship that is then teleological is precisely when its purpose is to be that which is never reducible to an expectation. The telos of a relationship is to be that which is never reducible to an expectation, the negation of the negation, the beautiful, right? How do you do that? Well, one of the reasons I think this distinction between intention and flow is so good is because we don't know. All we can do is the work of keeping the will going toward that. Teleos, Aristotle. All we can do is the work to keep the thing going toward it, because that end, if you realize it, means it's dead and it's not eternal, right? So the teleology of a relationship must be that of which is the ever creative act of the relationship that can only be aligned with by the making of riverbanks that flow toward it, that keep going, and the intention is to keep it moving, and anger is a feeling of it, the break. And so you have to realign, because if that break occurs, you've lost the justice, and if you've lost the justice, you've lost the what? The telos. And the telos is the movement toward the telos that is ever so, ever so, ever so. Because otherwise it's not eternal, and it's not creative, and it's not fully human. So that's the weird thing. Like the telos of a relationship is to keep moving toward the relationship, toward the ever unfolding, because eternity is that which is a movement that doesn't end, which makes it sound like it's not moving at all, but actually it's ever moving because it's ever changing to higher and higher qualities. So there's clearly a change, even if it doesn't end, but it's not a quantitative change, it's a qualitative change. Change in eternity is a qualitative one. That's how you can have a quantitative endlessness that is nevertheless qualitatively changing, because the qualitative change, which is experientially distinct, ergo phenomenological, just like the phenomenology of emotion, is distinct even if it's quantifiably not distinguishable. So that's another thing. The telos of relationships are not quantifiable, but they are qualitatively noted. If the quality is changing, then you have reason to think that you are moving toward the telos, even if you can't quantify that you're moving toward the telos. Well, that means phenomenology is very important here. That's why the phenomenology of emotion may also be training in the gauging of if one is making that qualitative development that would be characteristic of a relationship as distinct ontologically from objects. Well, let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please.
Yeah, I would love to continue to play with this river bank analogy. 'Cause I just came from a 6-month internship, and it was at a national park, and I created this educational program on this creek restoration project that was like intended to enhance the habitat of the salmon in that creek. And like what happened was when the park was founded like 100 years ago, they had to, get all of these trucks and, maintenance trucks to build and pave the trails and to build the bathrooms, like literally construct the park. And so to make room for that road, they destroyed a lot of vegetation. And so what that did was, like, vegetation is a natural erosion control because, it absorbs water, it goes into the soil. So there was just like rampant flooding in the creek. Like for 2 years, there was just every winter the creek flooded. The roads were flooded. And so what they did to resolve that was they put all of these huge boulders called riprap like around the creek to act as a dam. And what they didn't foresee was that those boulders like completely reshaped the structure of the creek. And so where there was, all of these kind of meanders and curves, all of those kind of got straightened. And so what that did was it increased the velocity of the creek, which like the little, salmon eggs got destroyed, the little salmon got washed away. The creek also became less deep. So like those little salmon, couldn't like hide underneath the depths of the creek from birds and other predators. And so like I was just kind of playing with that in my mind, like, when they paved the road and they destroyed the vegetation, that kind of made the creek like very porous and exposed. And like analogously, that could be, thought of as someone who like, has no boundaries, lets anyone in, essentially. Anyone who, gives them attention, lets them in, and doesn't really have like a great kind of like ability to detect, danger and threat from like authenticity. But then they responded by, putting all these boulders, which, can be thought of as kind of like the get off my lawn, like rigid boundaries, as a way to kind of like keep people out kind of thing. And so I really like, and then like in the last 5 years, they've done all this restoration where they've taken into account, all the species, and like really kind of a nature first solution by, taking out all this riprap, placing, vegetation in, and like they have the telos of the next generation, 2 generations, 3 generations of like what success looks like, which is a return of life and a building of a healthier ecosystem. And so I think if boundaries are thought of as a way to promote like the building of a relationship, then they won't be thought of as, let me erect my picket fence to keep you out, because, a house with, I mean, we can all kind of like fantasize about, a house away with like away in the woods with, a lot of security and like this massive driveway, and it's away from people. But it's like, that's not as vibrant of a ecosystem of a house as one that's like engaged with neighbors and is like open and inviting and like, is continuing to grow and like, invite new perspectives in and things like that. Then, I think if boundaries have that kind of telos, then that's how we will approach relationships. And I think then connecting that back to anger, then I think like, because I see it often, like anger, I think the difference between anger and hatred to me is like, hatred feels a lot more final and like certain, and anger feels a lot more of the moment. And I think once people kind of have their hatred calcify, that's a real way for them to keep people at arm's length. And I think if you continue to have the telos of like relationality as like primary, and relationality to people and nature and also the divine, then anger seems to kind of lose its grip, like lose its like just firm grasp and firm hold on someone, and it's used to fuel change to continue to build towards more relationality. But yeah, I'll give it back.
No, I mean, it's excellent, because what's very interesting there, ultimately, it seems like there's kind of three things you almost have to keep up: telos, situation, and maybe flow. Or maybe those are the three, right? Because if you're defining things as things and you think of those telos, you can create the borders in different things, but you lose sight of the environment and the situation, you get all sorts of trouble, right? And then, of course, Owen Barfield and all these people talk about there's not really things, but situations, right? So if you're thinking about the telos of things, there's a way in which you're not even thinking about telos at all. You're thinking about just ends. They're kind of they're counterfeits, right? Like there's a way in which telos is always relational. If it's not relationship, it's kind of low dimensional, right? And what ends up happening with that example of the river, which is a wonderful example, is you're thinking about the river, but outside the effects of the environment, right? So instead of thinking about the river, like the river bed has to also keep in mind the bed and the river and keep those whole things going together, right? And that's what's and what's very interesting is that you have to be thinking about the entire environment, right? Also, though, what's important with that is that's where metaphysics and telos really, really, really need an awareness of nature, and like very phenomenological an awareness, where it's your like first order, second order, third order thinking, like a Thomas Sowell or whatever, right? Is where like, but that's where, dare I say, phenomenology is so big, because before you say, oh, this river, we need to, we need to control the flow. Okay, well hold on. You might be a little bit of the technological essence there. You might be too much of just thinking technology, problem, solution. Let's really look at it for a while now. Let's really kind of pay attention to it before we move. Let's watch how it moves, like Aristotle watching things and then moving to metaphysics before, staying in physics to metaphysics, right? But this is where Flannery O'Connor is like, you got to gauge, you like Cezanne, like really, really, really looking at something is really important before you start moving. And one of the reasons is because the brain cannot handle thinking the entire situation. So there's like humility there, right? But at least if you really, 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 really look and try to see it all, then when you screw up, at least there's a less likelihood it's a bad screw up, right? Because whatever incomplete thought that you do, because you're never going to have, your painting will never equal the thing, right? But that doesn't mean all paintings are equal, right? And there's something about really gazing and observing and really taking it in that goes a long way to avoiding unintentional consequences, right? Well, now I'm thinking about rituals in religion, observation, practices, habits, like spending time together. There's something about all of these things that are like, we are ultimately going to have to act. And the brain really sucks at thinking situation and environment instead of things and single goals. But maybe if we really, 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 really try to dwell together and really try to continually take in the whole, then when we act, we may have less unintentional consequences than not. But whatever unintentional consequences occur, since we are committed to this relationship, since we are committed to this environment, we'll be there for them. And that makes me think of Clayton's comment on the relationship ignorance. There's always a certain ignorance, right? There's always a certain unknowing, right? But there's a certain commitment to really trying to be here, to act with the whole situation in mind, that then knowing there's going to be some sort of ignorance, something that you don't fully see, you'll then be ready for it. You'll be prepared for it because you can't plan for it. And then because you are teleologically committed, you will have a heuristic by which to make a new decision for that thing that is unexpected, right? And yeah, I mean, yeah, sure. And I should just note, yeah, you could use boundary to talk about making a home, a place to be, walls to house. The problem is, in my experience, a lot of times, and then I'll give it to Jockin, Michelle, and Javier, a lot of times the book Boundaries, the cover is of a what? Fences. It's a cover, like very often in that series on boundaries or when people talk about it, the main metaphor they show is a fence. Well, if by boundary they meant like the invisible boundary of a national boundary dividing, or a state boundary between Virginia and North Carolina, where there is a distinction, but it's kind of invisible, that might be a little closer to what boundaries are like in relationship. But if your main image for the metaphor is a fence, that's basically saying the husband lives in this house, the wife lives in that house. That doesn't sound good. Aren't you both within the same fences, right? Like if the main image you're putting on the cover of all your books is of a fence, that's a problematic notion of boundary that actually can lead to some issues, right? Or instead, because like if you're creating the boundaries to determine where the road is or the path is or the river is so that it flows, fine. But again, this is where it's all it's like we're saying that you really have to think about the way the metaphor is situating the idea. We were saying earlier that if you have the wrong ideas about anger, wrong ideas about things, you can be led in a very problematic direction, right? Like, and it is not self-evident that there is a distinction between anger care and anger hate. So it is not self-evident that when we talk about boundary, it doesn't necessarily have to go in the direction of fence. But to me, that's where you need a kind of responsibility for your metaphors. If you're going to use the language of boundary, make sure the covers of your books isn't fences, right? Make sure it's something more like the edges of where the color red changes to the color blue. And there's a boundary of where red is and where blue begins, like the gradient of a sky. Like if by boundary you're saying, oh, this is where red begins and this is where blue ends, but it's all part of the same picture, okay. But that's not naturally where the brain goes when it talks about boundary. So this is where a certain responsibility to assure a proper understanding of your metaphor, I think, becomes important. And I think the language of boundary, which is very common in many cultures, is very suburbanated. Very much taken into that private property, and thus leads to some unintentional consequences that don't really necessarily help one with the idea of flow, with the movement of the will and stuff like that. That's just a thought that comes to mind. But I am thinking about telos, situation, flow. Like, what is the telos of things based on what they are, based on what the situation is, and what is the flowing in that situation that we need to maintain. And we coordinate our action relative to those three, which again, just sounds like classical metaphysics. If we take Aristotle, there's a situation in which things are moving toward a certain end and the movement is the flow, right? Isn't that all the metaphysical structure? And justice seems to be when telos, situation, and flow go together, and injustice is when there seems to be a break between those things. I'd have to expand on it, but let me give it to Mr. Jockin. Mr. Jockin.
Great conversation. Lots said. I have a lot to reply or add on to this. So let's start with the first one. Actually related to one of my recent writings, related to basically phusis, basically in nature. So that was brought up here. Because I bring this up because I think a lot of people get really bent out of shape with telos because they're thinking, oh, clearly that's a subjective preferencing or stamping onto reality of this is the end of this thing. But I think even Aristotle very clear to clarify that. I was like, wait a minute, what's the end of a horse? Like, you see, like the answer would be the enegeia, the activity of the horse. It's the end of the horse, right? And that's can be expressed via a kind of, actually, this is where health becomes a very important aspect of it. So where we can judge a quality of a horse by their activity of their horse, which is like they're able to run, their capacities, their activities. It's not one thing. It's not a quantified stamping down. But this brings up the point that really telos has a direct relationship to physis, nature. And that directly corresponds to what I wrote about last week about it. Traditional Platonic thought scholarship has said that eidos and idea are the same. They're just synonyms. He's using very casually. He's just swapping in and out. I'm of the opinion, and I've done my reading since that essay. I'm doubling down on that thesis. I think they are distinct because, and I'll tell you my reason why. To quickly summarize what I wrote about from Timaeus, idea is basically the same and other forcibly brought together under violence. This is where ideology comes in, right? So when it's an ideology, there's these basically conceptual images, these ideas that you stamp onto reality, and when things do not fit that model or fit that image, you compress down. I bring this up because of the relationship. The whole point, why are some expectations reasonable and others not, is because some of them are related to the physis and the eidos of what is to be a relationship, and others are the idea of a relationship. We're really just a stamping of an idea of an image of the good for a particular individual. So to kind of play that out a little further, the essence of a relationship, one of the aspects of it is trust. We must trust each other to have a relationship. There is no relationship without trust as one aspect of it. A more general part, and this is actually where you can make an argument in defense of boundaries, is the idea of duty and responsibility. We have a responsibility to each other. So boundaries allow us clarity of who is responsible for what. And those things are and then the whole point is responsibility to build trust that we can count on each other for what? Well, ultimately, relationships are the relationship of virtue in terms of cultivating a virtue in a friendship, which is to wish the good of the other as other, right? To use Aquinas' language about it. Which, again, kind of similar to what's the telos of a horse. What's the telos of a relationship? It's the activity, it's the enactment of activity of excellence, right? So what's an excellent relationship? That's exactly the point. See, a relationship, we actually related to like husbands and wives or partners. We do have an example of a telos, a kind of stamping down of explicit expectation. It's called prostitution. Do you notice that? Like we already have that. That's addressed. So why what's the general relation of not prostitution? Because there's something about a kind of creative act that a relationship fosters possibilities that are not capable, that are not preset and known. That's usually the example of enduring hardships and suffering, right? There's that one direction, but there are other directions too. Generation of children, things that are not possible to any one individual, basically family ventures, cultivation of larger relationships, new capacities and functions. In a healthy relationship in modern times would say things like improving the spiritual development of each other as spouses and of the children, for example, or your larger family units, or learning new skills together, or new activities. It's kind of like you're championing each other, to use the kind of contemporary language. This is all the nature of a relationship. This is the physis, which is the development over time. That's kind of the thing. So physis and eidos are related to understanding of things over time. So we understand that a horse goes from a baby horse to an adult to an elderly and passes away. Right, that developmental understanding of relationships, that's what eidos is talking about. It's part of the nature of the thing. That's how we have any conception of things, under knowledge of it, is that there's an understanding over time. And that relation, and I think, Daniel, your note about the metaphorical effect of boundaries, right, of the dam riverbank versus the dam, excellent. Because that's the whole point. That's the difference of an eidos versus an idea. They kind of draw this out. That's why I brought this up, because a dam is a very clear fixing idea. You stamp, boom, you just slamming down an image of what this needs to be with a very clear understanding. Versus a riverbank is and that's by the way too from Aristotle. I'm going to jump in another note, is a material necessity consequence versus a hypothetical necessity consequence. What I mean by that is the riverbank got formed by a certain natural material causation, right? There's a certain nature of the riverbank got formed by the erosion factor, all that. Versus a dam is hypothetically stamped in by a causer very explicitly. So that's already a distinction is right there drawing out. But what are the consequences? The problem with the dam is that usually it has a very limited bandwidth of reference, usually maybe at best one level of order of causation thinking. not thinking of it, as Michael's point, really great demonstration of it. You made things more efficient. You made things efficient, but you destroyed the larger properties of the entity, the biosphere, for example. And I had noted in here that, it's funny, the efficient just kills the beautiful. This is a really great example. That's a really great example of it. Because meaning the beautiful as this kind of revelation of redounding activity that's unexpected, unknown, surprise, right? These kinds of things. Even just the continued existence without a second external intervention. That's the key. By having to smooth things out, clearing the ways, like this very linear approach, it actually required, it made the environment unsustainable. It actually made it unstable. One of virtue's qualities is the persistence of existence over time. That's one of its signs. So we see that's lacking in that example of this kind of idea, hypothetical necessity stamping onto the natural space. I say this, by the way, related to the beautiful, because in my course I'm working on now, and one of the aspects that's really interesting in the book of geometry, because the way I was taught in art school, the approach, the geometric, was that the square was first. And from the square, basically from line to square, and from square to circle. The Greek, Romans, exactly the opposite. From the line, you got the circle, and from the circle, you got the square. Now, you would think who cares? Because they're convertible, you can go one to the other. Actually, it makes a huge difference, because which one is more efficient? The goddamn square one. You can basically produce things much more modularly efficient with the square, if your starting point is there, of geometric planes. Versus when you work with the circle first, as your first geometric object, your first principle, it actually creates all the beauty we see in ancient architecture. That's where it's coming from. To understand why we sense a very clear visceral difference between modern architecture and ancient architecture, that is one of those first principle reasons. And both of them were concerned with efficiency. It wasn't that. It's just that which one you start with as your first premise results in completely different architectural results. What I'm getting at here is notice that motion for efficiency stripped away all these things that were not accounted for by the idea, versus eidos of the nature of things. You have a deeper understanding of how things operate and work with each other. And by the way, another note is actually related to time. Basically, when you're looking at your time, the window of reference of your object of intention makes a big difference. Are we looking at basically what's efficient for this objective in this basically pathway, or we're looking at a larger ecosystem over, as Michael said, a generation or 2 generations down the line? Those change the relationships a lot, which is obviously the opposite. By the way, I'm gonna last note with orientations based on hate, right? So when you give an object, your object is against another, it's hate. It gives you clear boundaries. Listen, we talked about this belonging again, right? Like, reason why we know how to create belonging. We're very good at it. It's make an other, wish to destruction, and say us versus them. And now you got a boundary. You just made a clearing. Congratulations. But the problem is that's based on a privational state negation, and it causes it's inevitable. That's an idea, right? That's not a nature. It's an idea imposing itself onto the space, the shaping of things. So then I find that that's an interesting kind of way of talking through how anger can be generated through and produce a misunderstanding of the expectations that are natural kinds versus ideas of preference or trigger or responses to that. I think that's quite important. And the images we use to talk about that, as you said, Daniel, great statement. Metaphors import ontological consequences. I think that's absolutely true. And I think your points here are making that very clear. But I think the only caveat about this damn riverbank, the clearing issue, is the idea of clearing, basically setting up expectations, setting up what's the nature of responsibility and duty and trust. That'll be the only counterpoint about why these matter. Kind of on that point of the tragedy of the commons, to use that example, was because if everybody has ownership of something with no one having responsibility to it, then it falls apart. It destroys itself. So that tends to be the kind of the balancing act of response of how do we address what boundaries are about. They're not about keeping other people away. It's actually not ironic. It's not about keeping other people away. It's about you're actually bounding yourself to a duty for this thing. That's kind of interesting. Isn't that an interesting nuanced difference? Versus no, it's about you keeping away from me versus I'm bounded to this. Isn't that interesting? It's very subtle details. Very interesting. Okay, that's what I got.
No, that's huge, because to me, the language of boundary is one for tasks and a clear action. It cannot be a language to define the
qualities of the relationship, which is more of a state. Like if I say the boundary is I do this, you do that, I'm responsible for this, and it's very task-based, that's its power. It's a metaphor of task and bind to an operation. But when you use it to define the qualities of the state of relationship, well, you turn relationships into work. That's of course what happens when it's all boundary. Boundary is a work language. So when that's the prime metaphor of relationships, and relationships feel like a job, people are keeping spreadsheets, everyone's trying tit for tat, keeping lists, and everyone's unhappy. So the boundaries could be the work of maintaining, like the maintaining of the environment, but it cannot be the language of the environment. The language of the environment is more like a painting. It is more like something that's flowing, and boundaries are the areas of responsibility to keep the painting itself, to keep the flow going, right? It's a boundary is a language of commitment and responsibility, and this is the area in which that commitment and responsibility occurs for the sake of finishing the task. But boundary is also a finite game language, not an infinite game language. Like that's the like relationships are infinite games to you that carve, right? That's why that metaphor can lead to unintentional consequences. But you're right, there is a good way for it in the way you're describing, but that's in the realm of like task and finite games and maintaining the space, right? I think you also said, I'll give it to Javier, Jason, and then Michelle. I think also what you're saying on telos cannot be overstated in its importance, because telos is something that is really observational, really phenomenological, really, you have to look at something really hard. That's why the conflation of telos and idea is problematic, because I can go, oh, that's a cup, and have no relationship with it whatsoever. I can just walk in and say, oh, and give it an idea. But that's not a telos. Like that's an idea in the sense, to go to your subset, like what you're saying, right? The telos has to be tied to this certain sort of painter, Cézanne sort of look at it. Like really be in a commitment to it. I think also it should note this idea that things have a telos. Like try sitting still. It's really hard to sit still as a human being. Like try to look at something. It's really hard to look at something. It's really, try to keep your mind still. Your brain is flying everywhere. Everything has will. It has this movement to it. It's just going, right? And so you see in the very phenomenology of the subject something that has this kind of go-ness to it, right? This kind of movement-ness to it, right? Which one suggests evidence that things are in them very selves energized, like action, like there is something in things that has a umph to them. Now, to say, I'll give it to Javier. The issue is this, I think. Basically, the telos of objects is far easier to determine than the telos of people. And the only way you find a telos is by a commitment. So when you love someone, you're committed to the observation of the whole situation of themselves to arise at the telos, which then you commit to yourself helping flow, right? Like I can kind of figure out pretty generally what the telos of a cup is in 5 minutes. If I want to know the telos of like Michelle, that requires a lifetime. And because what is the classical love and knowing? You love someone, you know them, right? What do you know? Well, the telos. Well, how do you know that? I don't know. All I know is I have to commit to the place in which I can observe it, and then whatever I observe, I can never replace violently with an idea. That's the trick. Love is where you're observing something, you don't make an image. That sounds impossible. Yeah, because if you leave it, you can't do it. The only way to observe something without a violent image, like you're saying, Mr. Jockin, is to be there. That's the only way. You have to be there. Like I can look at that door right now and not make an image because I'm looking at it. Like the image of an idea, right? But that means what? You have to be there. And this is where it seems love as commitment and telos all go together, because the only way to have like a teleological experience of a person and it not be replaced by the violent of an image is to be there. So there's something about that commitment to the observation that's really important. There's more to say, but let me give it to Javier, Jason, Michelle, and then Michael. Javier, please.
Well, I mean, that's why I think like a relation to suffering is very important to this bearing. Like even the Buddhists talk about, you know, when you're angry, the antidote to that is patience. Why? Why is patience the virtue to abide in? And it's because you could say that to cultivate patience is to give yourself the space to even encounter this distinction that Jockin is talking about. Precisely because the will is always going. Everything is energized, as you say, Daniel. So this idea or this ability to bear, I think is very important. And I think a lot of the conversation around dating is kind of funny because like in some ways like they seem to talk about it like a task, like a list. They seem to avoid the anxiety of suffering. And gets really interesting that it kind of got infiltrated by a kind of theology of Christianity, right? Where it's like, okay, so as a man, you have your duties. As a woman, you have your duties. But what I've noticed is that this kind of got hijacked in the dating discourse. And it became like a kind of like task list to like blame the other, which I find really interesting. And that's apparently what masculinity is. That's apparently what femininity is, right? So I find that really interesting because there's another aspect that they're really missing there, which is this idea of do not judge, right? And we had a long conversation about do not judge. And it's just really this idea of just like we don't condemn the other person. Why don't we condemn? And I think this is really interesting to bring up Jockin's distinction between phusis and idea, because scriptures seem to point to the fact that phusis is saying that you yourself as a being cannot condemn someone, right? Like there's something about our nature that is imperfect. So it seems to make little sense to give an absolute judgment on something versus a correction or a talking about about what was done wrong versus condemning the whole being themselves. And I think in the dating discourse, and especially, I think this is also the distinction between anger, hatred, is anger, hatred wants to condemn. It actually wants to find every excuse to condemn versus anger, care, like, I'm not going to condemn you, but I understand there's something done wrong here, or there's a misunderstanding. Like, there's so much investigation required before you even get to the part where you engage in a correction, I would say. And I would say that we would probably have very little corrections if we decide to do the investigation first. In fact, I think what most people conflate between correction and condemnation is exactly that. They think their correction is a correction itself, and when in actuality, it's a condemnation. And that can destroy relationships completely when you're constantly condemning your partner. Because you're just destroying, you're destroying them. And then you're saying this in the name of boundaries. In the name of boundaries, I condemn you, kind of like thing, So yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, I think that's very well put.
Well, just to that, and I'll give it to Jason, Michelle, and Michael there. I think, again, there's a way in which if judgment leads to, like, judgment has this potential leading to trouble, right? And there's this idea we were saying about justice being broken leads to anger. And if one doesn't know how to handle that, well, let's just get rid of judgment. That would do it, right? Well, the problem is getting rid of judgment then leads to one always being on a kind of watch guard for who's judging. It's also kind of impossible. Like we talked about the difference between assessment and judgment. Judgment is when I say you are a liar. Assessing is when I said you lied, right? Judgment has this kind of defining of the essence. You shouldn't do that, but it's impossible not to assess. And in fact, if you don't assess, you could be taken advantage of, right? Well, I'm not going to judge them. Well, they screwed you over then, right? So we don't, but that's another distinction that we were saying earlier. Phenomenology, there's a distinction between judgment and assessment. So what's the nature of reality, blah, 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 right? So the issue becomes, though, one, if people aren't doing philosophical distinctions to know that distinction. And two, if there's this constant feeling of there's something about judgment that leads to trouble, and you don't know how to order it according to metaphysics, emotions, discernment, then the only option seems to be to get rid of judgment, right? Well, let's just get rid of judgment by getting rid of a sense of right and wrong. Well, that seems like a good idea. It's a reasonable idea, but unfortunately, it's probably not true and doesn't seem to be true, and also betrays the nature of reality itself. That's why we're talking about this phenomenology metaphysical connection, it seems, right? Like, it seems to be, when you look at reality, that there are, well, in relationships, from experience, it seems like there's a right way to approach anger and a wrong way to approach anger, right? And it also seems to be like it's really important to discern that difference, right? Okay, so there is a need for something like judgment. It seems to be that there are good and bad distinctions, and it seems to be the case that you want to be able to discern those differences, right? Well, then it probably isn't a really good bet to throw out judgment entirely and to throw out good, right, and wrong entirely, even if a very high number of uses of right and wrong in judgment are for the sake of control and power, right? But what is the effing difference? The experience, the ontology, the observation, like the really paying close attention to the unfolding of the thing itself, right? Like, but how do you learn to see? Really not easy. But some sort of commitment, and if you need to learn to see and you can't see, you're going to grope around in the dark, so you're going to make mistakes. But the fear of error is the fear of truth. So there's some sort of necessary groping that goes through. I'll stop there. I'm now thinking also like on Telos, like, because there's something too where like Telos and end and all that. But let me stop. Jason, please. It is good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well.
Good to see you too. This is a great conversation. Yeah, just to tap into what you were saying, the what's interesting about the faculty of the understanding is that it's both inevitable, right? It's a great force. We can't help it. This kind of judgment of the understanding has to be made, but at the same time, they're fundamentally untrue because they are in the phenomenal world, which is by definition not true, an appearance and not reality. But then what's amazing about phenomenology, as a practice, is that it can free up these appearances in themselves, there's a kind of freedom, at the end of it. If you're building something, I think we're building freedom, and maybe freedom of experience, but you can see it in two ways, right? You can see it as a freedom of your experience or the experience itself becoming free, and maybe this is the subtle difference, between anger, hate, anger-hate, and anger-care, there is a kind of subtle difference. We were talking about boundaries, and flow. And I think in things like if you've heard of like tensegrity or something like that, there is always a tension in the flow. So I think anger, care, and anger, hatred can be intermeshed in some interesting way to hold something up, to hold maybe human community, human relationships. The thing is that with anger, hatred, I think we're beholden to experience. Anger, hatred, to me, there's a quality about it that feels kind of good, and this is also the feeling of judgment, right? The feeling of the understanding that I think we can become beholden to. I think we're beholden to the heuristics we make. It feels good when the heuristic flows, as you were saying before. But where in anger, care, I think there is a kind of well, okay, before that, let me just say that when we feel good in anger, hate, we want to continue it. I experienced this in my personal life where, the pettiest form of angers, I kind of want to maintain throughout the day? You know, have you, like, this is a very childish thing, but have you ever just wanted to just keep being angry for like a day or two? You know, I mean, you know, and you listen to shitty music, like, and so on. You know, it's a known fact that you kind of want to be depressed, right? There is a big aspect of pleasure in negative emotions. And this is, I think, the main activity of anger hate is to maintain this state, you know. Anger care is also, I feel, a form of maintenance, but it's a maintenance of like a higher, you know, when we think about like caring about other people, you know, it's not, it has a different relationship with pleasure, let's say, you know, it withholds pleasure for, you know, there's almost a higher satisfaction it it achieves, you know. But then you also get some interesting intermeshing of the two of them. If you ever watch the movie Drive My Car, you know, there is this character, there's this the driver, the woman driver, who basically, the point is that in even within abuse, she cares enough to find something worthwhile about, in this case, her mother, you know, her abusive mother, you know, like she holds, you know, it is both true that the mother was abusive and loving. That's fundamentally, like, it can be both true, you know. And I mean, this just I guess you can connect it to what you were saying about commitment, you know, because uh you take the risk of holding this contradiction, you know. You need to, in order to build this thing, you know, this freedom of experience, you know. Yeah. And perhaps I'm kind of rambling here, so I think I'll stop. But I guess let me just end real quickly with a comment about reality. I really love what you said about reality being teleological, and this is something that I've often think about. You know, I of a great interest to me. You know, like, I can't help but think about you know, in terms of what you said about commitment as observing the other. You know, you observe them, and I think I'd like to extend it. We want to observe them to be free. You know, like when I take care of my family members, you know, like I do these things to observe them be themselves, you know, like oh yeah, that's really cool, you're doing hockey now, or something like that, you know. Uh, but to me, you don't just observe, right? And this is something that we see in physics empirically, right? The act of observing is also, you're not detached from the observed, you know. There is the you are, as you observe them, you are you're making themselves, you know. And yeah, that's the only way you can be there, I think, is this quantum loop. I don't know. I'll stop here now. I'm totally rambling.
No, you're not at all. That's brilliant. I'll give it to Michelle and Michael. But that's a huge point, because I think in religious traditions, there was an idea, it's observe, honor. Like, observing was never, or traditionally, observing was not merely looking at. There was some sort of participatory and formative act that occurred in observing that we've lost sight of, which there is something too about, well, if we take teleology seriously, if you observe a thing in a manner that leads to its disclosure of its teleology, then it does in a very real sense change to you. Like, the cup, when it has a teleology, is different than when it doesn't, per se, right? So there is a kind of quantum move that happens where the observer effect changes the thing without changing it, and yet it does. Like, the changes in the appearance, right? Of course, which is Hegelian, right? And of course, in Hegel, essence is the appearance, because if a thing doesn't appear, it didn't have essence, right? That's the flip. What's interesting is the teleological appearance of the thing is the coming through of the essence, which then changes the thing that is there in its materiality and efficient cause, and yet is more than that. And it's really weird. And the only way to get it is to what? Observe it. It only makes sense if you observe it. But that seems circular. No, it's not. You can do it too. Just come here. Well, I don't want to. I'd rather stand here and say you're dumb and be right because I never do it, so the evidence is on my side and I get tenure and you don't, right? That's the problem. Like, if you have things that can be only known in the act of observance and participation, and you basically say, it's not subjective, you can come do it too, and that person says, I won't, well, then the evidence will show them we're right for not doing it. And another word for that is damnation. So, you know, that's the problem, is when we get to these matters, they can only be known in observation, which sounds like merely subjective, but it isn't. It requires a subject to do, but that doesn't mean it is merely subjective. The subject is the condition of possibility that allows observation of this way, right? And that's, we confuse subject as grounding of the possibility as merely subjective to discount it. That's the mistake. Like, the existence of the subject affords possibilities of observation, like you say, that then we can turn around and say, well, it's merely subjective. And by adding the word merely, we cut it out of our life. Merely is a fun word because it's a judgmental word. And what did we say earlier was so bad? In judgment, I say you are a liar versus you lied, and therefore I can do away with you. You're a liar, so your essence is corrupt, so I don't have to deal with you, right? By saying things are merely subjective, we are judging them versus assessing them, and in judging them, pushing them out of our life. And then we're damned. We're totally enclosed, right? So I really like what you're, because there's also something for Hegel, the reconciliation with the future. Like, observation, you are in that reconciling yourself with it. You are observing it, believing the thing. This is the weird move. You believe that in the act of observing it, it makes possible a freedom of that thing to itself that would not be possible if you weren't observing it, and you reconcile yourself to that process, all of which is freedom. Well, that's interesting. But is that not? But we see that in love all the time. Like, literally, when someone is looking at you, just as an example, I'll give it to Michelle. When someone is looking at you and they're not even doing anything, is that not different than when they're not looking at you? Like, it is a different situation when observation is occurring than when it's not, right? You feel it. You know it, right? And so what if there is a kind of freedom that is only possible in the subject when the subject is being observed by the other? No touching, no, just the mere act of observation brings something out of you that is an opportunity for freedom that could not occur, right? Well, I think this is basically provable in anger. When someone is looking at you that you're mad at, and all they're doing is looking at you, you have an opportunity to act in a manner that is different, right? When someone is mad at you and they're looking at you, that gives you, under that act of observation, an opportunity from a freedom, for a freedom that you choose, right? And I think you're getting at it very well. You know what, the freedom, you know, because you're right, there's a pleasure in anger. So anger hate seems to be anger pleasure, where you take pleasure in the anger. Like, because there is like, I'm going to tell you what I've been thinking, and I'm just going to tell you, dang it. There's a pleasure in just letting it go, right? So anger hate is when you let the pleasure be in the anger versus the care, right? You let pleasure take over care, right? And in that moment of observation of the other, when you are experiencing the break, that's when you have an opportunity to be free from anger pleasure. You can be free from it by how you respond. But it is only in that situation of observation that you are afforded the possibility of that freedom, right? Because they have to be there. If they're not there, you really can't get the freedom from freedom anger, because you kind of need them to be there to apologize or to see how you respond, right? It is in the it really is in the emotional experience that you see what Hegel is talking about. You see that there is a certain freedom afforded to you in someone observing you that is not possible if they're not observing you, right? And then, of course, the essence is what appears. So if when you're pissed off, what appears is anger, well, then the essence is anger hate, not anger care. But if what appears is care, then the essence is anger care, right? And please.
Yeah. No, just to add to the train of thought, you know, this is the interesting difference between being and nothing, right? Because they're the same and yet they're radically different. Yeah. They kind of are two aspects of the same, let's say, missing core, you know, like they're of reality itself, you know. And it's this, I think what you said about this, now we have this opportunity, you know, freedom at this moment of opportunity. I think in human relationships, what we are building is perhaps more freedom. So it's freedom to choose more freedom. And I think you choose to make a very subtle difference. You choose it's a very interesting difference. The different way to tackle the missing core of human relationships. Like you take the risk. One goes as in anger, hatred, where you have this feeling of pleasure. You can go on indefinitely, right? It's a kind of nothing. It's a kind of being that is also, you can go on and on and on.
Yeah.
Whereas in care, I think there is a missing core, but it doesn't matter. It's a despite. So, and yet I think, yeah. So anyway, I love what you're saying.
Well, what you're saying is very important, because in my mind, you know how I was saying earlier, you got two distinct rivers that merge and then split, and you can't. It seems to be when toward the same object that freedom can be most clear. Because if the objects change, it could just be causation. That's why you're getting a different reaction. But if you can have different reactions or different responses to the same phenomenon, that's uniquely powerful evidence of freedom, right? Because it's the same, and yet the appearance can be different, right? Well, then it's hard to reduce it to cause and effect, because it's the same, and yet there are different responses, right? So there's something about the sameness that actually shows the rivers of causation and freedom split, because you can be different. There can be a different appearance, and so essence is free, because essence can appear freely, distinct in similar situations, and so are not reducible to causation. I think anger is an example, but let me give it to Michelle and Michael. Michelle, please.
Yeah, it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all so much. So much has been said. I really want to meditate longer on the analogy that Michael was giving with like the boulders and the creek, and how there's that low order causality of like, we'll just keep it at its place. Let's put boulders around it. That way it doesn't flood, And it's funny because there's like both have the same goal. Well, nature seemed to have a goal of keeping the creek where it was, and with all of the flora and fauna and foliage, it would naturally keep the creek there. When that wasn't there, then it seemed to overflow. So it's not a bad intention, right, to keep the creek where it should be. Like, let's put these boundaries up, like these big stones. But it's like, oops, like that didn't end up, still now it's got these unintended consequences. And sometimes like the velocity, he said, it got faster, like the water got faster. So it's almost like its intensity happened in a different direct, like maybe it wasn't, I don't know, if I didn't remember this part, if it was still doing the flooding, maybe it didn't flood anymore, but now it's getting, it's really fast and it's having these other issues. And I was thinking about like how that relates to, well, yeah, I just have to think a little harder about that, because it makes me think about to kind of like incorporate anger with that. Like often with anger, there's this idea of like, just keep it like, it's almost like saying just keep anger in its right place. So like, let's put up the boulders, right? But really, there seems to be this like work of, instead of the intention, it's like the tending. All the time that you have plants and you have this, all of like the more diversity of the biodiversity and more life. Interestingly enough, before people got there to make the park, it was just kind of tending to itself. Now, if you do garden work, like it's a lot of tending to it. But I guess I'm just thinking about like some words, in terms of intention, because what I originally wanted to say was about how intention is like in the girl world or the girl circles. A lot of the advice sometimes I've had, women or other girls talk about is like, make sure that, he's intentional, like your partner or your spouse or your boyfriend, whoever it is, like whatever season of life I was in, like there's this idea, like if they're intentional, that's what matters, But I think that intention, so I'm going to go all over the place. So I'll put a pin in the creek thing right now, but intention is actually quite dangerous in this. And we know this, right? Like the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And, there's a good sense, there's something that's right about it, but there's something wrong about it. Because, when a lot of times I think anger gets worse or, reactive and accelerates between people because there's this assumption of the intention, right? Like you didn't do the dishes like we agreed to. So somehow we just take it like, oh, you intended to like not do it and make it harder for me. And you weren't being intentional about doing it. and it's like all of this, I feel like intention, it's weird because it comes from a good place. And there is something, again, that can be beneficial to it. But it seems like actually us always constantly reading intention is what accelerates, exacerbates, and reactivates anger and, angry expression, and assuming that if somebody's angry, like we take it personally instead of just realizing like they're angry. Like I was saying in the comments, okay, that person's angry. I'm actually going to just not listen to what they say, but just remember that probably what they're saying, they don't fully mean what they're saying right now. They're angry. So they're saying things because they're upset. Now, it doesn't mean there's no grain of truth in them, but it probably is not completely true. And it's weird, when I was younger, it was harder for me to connect that right away. And I took it so personally, whatever somebody said when they were angry. But now it's like automatically my brain just is like, nope, like they're angry. Just put that in the box right now, and you can, think about it or think about what they said, and maybe if there's some truth in that. But also they're angry. So don't start being like, yeah, they just, one thing they say that might imply like, oh, you're lazy. Then, oh, like, yeah, they just think I'm a lazy person. You just in your head, you just keep going with all this stuff about what, which again is about this like intentionality, intention and all of that. So it's like, but really you just end up being like in tension because of all of the intentionality and reading intention into stuff and reading what somebody says when they're angry. Like it's weird because in some ways I think there's a real raw truthfulness in anger, but there's also something that's that's quite clouded and not hyperbolic and not true. So you have to sort of take the bothness of that. And I think just, kind of just slow down and not really jump on, oh, that's what they think about me, well, maybe not, maybe they're just angry and they were like controlling their mouth. So there's that. But yeah, I think I want to reflect more on the creek thing also, because as a parent, I feel like it feels a lot like I am just establishing the boundaries a lot, like boundaries as in the rules, right? Like, but I was like, well, maybe I always assume that's like, I'm being too regulatory and like kind of, like I'm just, all I do all day is say no and stuff, even though obviously I say yes and no, but it can feel that way sometimes depending on how children respond. And it's like, maybe I'm seeing myself too much as boulders to that creek when really I myself am a tree. Like I am flora fauna. They are flora fauna. They are, children and parents are both these living beings that are part of the ecosystem. Yes, if you just like enforce a rule and you never give anything else, you never give the nurturing, you never feed, you never like, listen to, then you're kind of maybe just being that stalwart boulder, Now there's a place even for a boulder move sometimes, right? When it comes to like actual safety and like, I'm going to pick you up now and move you to a secure place because that's not safe in the road or whatever, you know what I mean? But what I'm trying to say is that it's interesting because it's like from the parental perspective, it feels more challenging to sort of like know, again, I'm sorry, I'm going a bit all over the place, but how, am I condemning? Am I, I'm correcting or am I condemning? Everybody usually takes a correction as that they're being condemned because it's our human nature, like I said, to read intention into stuff. And so we'll read like, oh, what you're intending is for me to feel bad, or I do feel bad, so you must want me to feel bad. You see what I'm saying? And so it's hard to parse those things of like, no, I'm just correcting because I care. If I didn't care, I wouldn't try to correct because I wouldn't care how you ended up being as a human being, or that you knew what was right or wrong, or that you could be safe or have healthier relationships because of learning this skill. You know what I'm saying? So it's the parental realm, I think, is quite challenging because of these, having to realize maybe, these distinctions, and they are still important. Like there are these distinctions, and there is this sort of sense of like, needing to correct, needing to sometimes enforce certain things, but not always seeing it as negative. Like I tend to just assume it's negative and that I'm not doing a holistic enough approach. But if you go too far in that realm, right? If you go too far in that realm, you oddly enough, I feel like end up being kind of boulder-like, even in your I'm not being a boulder type of approach. And I don't know if maybe something to get back to it is just to realize like you are a tree yourself, like you're a living being, they're living beings, you are tending to things constantly and perennially. And so in that sense, maybe that can help get back to that place of the nuance where, yeah, guess what? The foliage did keep the creek in its place, right? The parent's going to need to keep children in the place of their safety, nourishment, and also orderliness, which sometimes means rules. It's not, and so anyways, and we do need that. Like we do actually need that sort of structure and sense of order, et cetera. Otherwise, it can be quite chaotic. Though there can be a lot of, again, abundance, life, and spontaneity, organicness in all of that structure too. So I guess I just wanted to share the thoughts that were coming to mind from the conversation. But yeah, I'm thinking that maybe it can help me to realize it's not so much about, the goal actually is always about the creek staying in where it is, and for the fish to be able to have their baby salmons, like that's the goal. But it's like how, and like you said, probably it's to what you said too, Daniel, about actually actually taking the time to do that observational work that works on you, so that you're observing, like when you do observances in religion, you do certain, you don't just look at stuff and then expect it all to change and do whatever. It's like you have to change. And okay, last thing, I love that point, Jockin, about when you're saying about the bounding yourself to certain responsibilities, because it's so easy to think of boundaries, especially in the girl advice world of like, you got to keep your boundaries and blah 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 blah. But like boundaries are actually more of a commitment to your own self-regulation, I want to say, so that you can help regulate. Like if you do your self-regulation, yeah, that's going to mean what some people might call boundaries for certain other like beings around you in your life. But you have to do it too for yourself. Like it's not, and so I think it's so hard to think about it where it's not just like, because like you're saying, the metaphor of a fence or boundaries, it's just you put it there and it's there. And everybody else just doesn't bother the boundary, right? They know it's there, so they're not gonna. No. It's so much more like like you're saying, the sense of flow where okay, maybe flow is not the best word here. I mean, if I thought a little harder, I can probably relate it back to flow. But the main point is like this dialectic, right? Like it's you having to do quite a bit to self-regulate, so that you can regulate the environment, right? Regulate the sense of what's okay and what's not okay. Okay, like a very practical example, and then I'll stop talking, is, like let's say I'm finishing my meal. The children need something. They finish their meal. Maybe I've excused them. I try to keep everyone at the table while we're eating, just because it keeps a little more like, okay, it's eating time. We're all going to just eat till we're finished, right? But I'm a little bit of a slow eater, just to be honest. So they might be done and like, okay, well, you can be excused if you finished your food, blah, blah, blah. Take your dishes to the sink and you can go play, right? But then if it's like, mommy, can you get this, or can you do that for me? Or like, it's I need to just finish my meal. Like, yeah, if it's emergency, I'm going to get up. Okay. But I also need to have the sense of, so is that like, how does that fit into the boundary element? In a sense, it's like, if I do the self-regulation of holding to I'm eating right now. Like I am eating, I'm not mad about it. I'm not like upset about it. I'm just eating, and I understand you have a request, but you are going to need to wait. It requires something of both people, basically. It's not just here's my boundary. It's easy for me now, and everybody else just keeps bumping up against the fence. No, it's like, I have to do the work. You have to do the work for us to do that sort of dynamic. And again, it's very different if you're talking like adult to adult, but I think the point of the matter is it's still related, because boundaries are going to require you to self-regulate and do the work for that, versus just, here's my boundary and everybody's got to respect it, and then I'd be I'd be so much more of a sane person if everyone just did that. No, it's you. Like it's you needing to do that, not everybody else, though if you do that, it will also establish certain things that the environment is ordered by, if that makes sense. So I hope that, yeah, those are just some thoughts coming to mind. Thanks for letting me share. I loved hearing from everybody too.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Michael and Mr. Jockin if anyone has
As final things, please. I mean, there's a few things. So first off, I think what you're getting at with intention suggests why thinking this relationship between intention and will is so important, because intention needs to honor the will, right? If you just have good intention, or you like, I'm intending this, you use it in this kind of intention way, to use that kind of wordplay, it's very problematic. But if intention doesn't have a telos, if it doesn't have a thing it's trying to flow, it becomes a dogma, it becomes a justification, it creates all sorts of trouble, because, well, here's the thing. Intention requires a telos, so everyone just follows their good intention and make everything a lot worse, because everyone's good intent, well, there's There's no such thing as a bad intention. There might be a good intention with bad results, but if you intend it, you think it's good. Intention is always teleological, right? It has to be. The question is if the teleology of the intention will be through the will and in the will, or if it will replace the will. And very often it replaces the will. It comes in conflict with the will, as opposed to honoring and reconciling itself to the flow. And then the question is, what is the telos of the will? Well, then that gets into things like the beautiful, the good, and the true, and the ever creative, right? That's what we were saying earlier, right? Like if you commit to a relationship, you are committing to the will as this ever unfolding creativity. So the intention has to be in service of that, not its own idea of the good of the intention. But that's what Mr. Jockin was saying about intention based on idea, the violence of idea and image versus telos, right? So a non-observational intention becomes very problematic. I think also, like what you're saying too with the boundary, yeah, like a boundary where you've set because in there it's like, if I don't eat, I'm like, the flow is bad. There is no flow. It's a bad day, right? So there's a way of holding the boundary for the sake of the environment, not simply an arbitrary, oh, it's like you're a bad kid because you want me to get up and do something, right? You're not saying that. You're simply setting the conditions for the unfolding of the home, right? But also what's interesting about that is the boundary is actually one that demands something of you, because it would be easier just to give it over, right? It'd be easier just to be a doormat, right? I think that's an important characteristic. That is a experiential quality of when you're probably dealing with something that's like a riverbed, not merely a boundary, like not a bad boundary. Like if the boundary is actually kind of hard on you to set, that's when you're probably dealing with something that's not like like an idol or dogma. That's actually something that you need to observe to change yourself in the way we were speaking with Jason about. I think that's very important. Well, before I forget, the very fact that adulthood, anger, like you're saying, anger also has a cloudy dimension, right? There's a cloudy dimension, there's a clear. The very fact that emotions have this bothness to it is, again, a phenomenology of emotion that suggests that reality itself is dialectical, that reality itself is teleological, that reality itself is movement, that it is an unfolding that is not reducible to the understanding but must entail reason, right? The very fact that, yeah, Bergson, exactly. Like the very fact that it's not obvious, like there's like, it's this bothness, like emotions unveil bothness. You experience this bothness in operation in the phenomenology of emotion. And I would argue that these are like the most, there's a real sense in which the phenomenologies of emotion you're describing are almost the most real moments of life. Like when life feels most real. Like when life feels most intense. Let's say that. Like life has this certain intent. When you as an adult need to go, I don't, am I setting good boundaries or bad boundaries? I don't want my children to be miserable. I want my children to thrive, but whatever. Like that intensity of the experience is always intense because of ambiguity, because of bothness. That intensity occurs because will and intention, will is here, will wants to know where to go, intention doesn't know where to go. It's just like anger in this, and it does feel like it's like, I'm not, like, does not those moments bring with it a feeling of anger? Because the directionality of will is not clear. And so moments of vast intensity, which are those, if they are in fact intense, the question would be, what are the conditions of reality to make possible that intensity of experience? And the very fact that it is intense, there must be in the fabric of reality that of which makes it possible for it to be intense. Therefore, there would be reason to think that there is reality to this intensity. And what is the experiential quality of the intensity? It is bothness, it is movement, it is dialectical, it is a having to make some sort of reconciliation and judgment of the situation, of which seems like moving into reason, speculative reason from understanding, determining the telos, determining the motion. Maybe that's because reality is that way. Like, maybe it's because reality is that way. Maybe, so this is where I think the phenomenology of emotions and these particularly intense moments are of particular importance to analyze because it gives us reason to think of a certain metaphysical schema. But let me give it to Michael and then Jockin if anyone has final things. Michael, please.
Yeah, I don't even know when I raised my hand, and I don't know if I have anything intelligent to say, so I think I'm just gonna probably be very short and sweet, and I don't know, leave it to Thomas. But I really liked what Michelle said about like intention and like being in space tension. I was like I was like walking around and like my jaw was like, "Ah, what?" But like I think that's really good because I think a lot of times it seems like people like convince themselves that they have good intentions when I don't think they always do, and they kind of like use that as a way to excuse themselves from like kind of disastrous consequences of their actions. It's like, oh well, my intentions were pure, like so, like it's all well and good, right? Like I'm kind of off the hook, and like the consequences were out of my control, and yeah, that seems. I don't think that always happens. I mean, I think that there is a place for. I had good intentions. I did from a caring place, but maybe it's like that life and care that even though it like came from this place of like, yeah, I'm really hurting, you disappointed me. The way I expressed that was also still hurtful in response. But I do think that there is a lot of times when, and I'm guilty of this too, being like, yeah, kind of telling myself that I have good intentions to kind of excuse myself of my own responsibility. And I really like, and then kind of connecting to that, I really like what Michelle said about boundaries as being, I don't know if it's appropriate to say boundaries are for yourself, because I think they are like eventually in service of the relationship, but like it being directed towards finding what it is that you do have control of in kind of a very stoic way, and like honing in on that instead of emphasizing what the other person could correct in their behavior, what they could do better, which is ultimately out of your control. And I think that's what breeds like these intense emotions, because there is this kind of helplessness in it of like, oh, I want you to change, but I deep down know that I can't really do that. But kind of paradoxically, like the way that I could cultivate change in you is by merely holding space and observing you. Back to what we were talking about observing, like in a lot of the psychotherapeutic literature, they talk about like the transformational effects of witnessing and listening, and just really looking deeply into someone's heart, into someone's soul, noticing and seeing things about themselves that they might not even be privy to. Like I can think of times when that's happened for me, and it's just a really beautiful thing. And even just like I was with someone the other day, and she was just like looking at me, and she was like I noticed like the eyelashes on the inside corner of your eye have like blonded tips on them, and your eyes have like a amber hue to them. And it's like I've gone 25 years without noticing that, and I've known this person for like 2 months. And it's like that's like just a really profound feeling on the other side of that, of being seen and of being noticed. And I think that can do a lot to diffuse intense emotions, because there is kind of a quality of anger of like kind of, and I think I was talking about this with you, Daniel, is like you're almost kind of running away as you're like running towards the thing. Like you're like very intensely like running towards this thing that you're angry about, or this person that you're angry about, but you're also terrified of how that's going to be received. And I think if someone can really just witness you in that anger, that desire to run away kind of lessens, because there's like a safety there. So yeah, that's all I have. I'll pass it back. Thank you for the time, and this discussion was absolutely phenomenal.
Oh, you're absolutely
Phenomenal. I love everything you said. Well, I'm thinking too, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin here. There's something imagey about and violent about intention. I had a good intention. It's a pure idea. Well, what did you have good observation though? Like it's funny, isn't it funny though how like really noticing something is a gift to people? Where often intentions are a curse. Like my intentions were good, or like I had good intentions, but it's funny how intentions can often kind of feel like empty. Like because if they're like, you know, if they love you, it's like, well, I know that. The intention is simply kind of like a given, but when they notice something they could have missed, oh, there's something more powerful about that, right? There's something kind of more meaningful. And that makes sense because observation and telos go together. And maybe the problem is we do way too much good intention and not enough good telos. Like not enough good observation for teleos. We're too busy with our ideas and the violence of our ideas and imposing them on the situation. And then when the results are bad, we say, well, I had good intentions, as if the ideas are more meaningful than the telos. And maybe that's why it's such a mistake. It's because you're saying, well, my intentions were this, so the consequence don't matter. You're basically treating intentions are a privation of telos then. There's a way in which they're a kind of privation, they're a kind of counterfeit of telos. Intentions are a counterfeit of telos. And I think there's a lot to, I think basically when people throw out telos, they're throwing out intention. They're confusing intention and telos. They're not the same thing. They're saying, well, I can imagine using this cup for anything, so it has no telos, right? It's like, that's just saying I can imagine an idea of it. That's not the same. You're making the mistake of conflating idea intention with telos, right? And I basically think what ends up happening is in a world of good intentions, like good intentions only make sense if there aren't telos as having, but if there were like are telos, then your good intentions were bad because they were wrong. What do you mean they were good intentions? They were wrong. They didn't observe the telos. You can't have good intent. Like that's like saying, oh, you had a good wrong answer on the quiz. Oh, the way you wrote the 5 after 2 + 2 equals was really beautiful. Oh, you used a really nice ink when you wrote that 5. It's like, no, there's no what? It's wrong. You know, so likewise, I think we say like good intention is the equivalent of saying you had really pretty handwriting when you wrote that 5 after 2 + 2. It's like, no, well, what's the answer, dang it? So likewise, like what is happening? Well, I think, and I'll give it to Jockin. I think in a world that's not very good at looking at what's in front of us, we talk about good intention. Like we're really bad at seeing, so we talk about intention, which sounds like we have intention, but it's what we do to make up for our inability to observe. We can think a lot. We can think of our ideas, so we have good intention, but can you see? Are you situational? Are you committed? Are you present? No, but I had good intention. I question how good that is. But let me give it to Mr. Jockin here. Mr. Jockin, please.
Build on what Michelle and Michael were talking about, and Daniel, what you're saying too. You know, it's funny in the sense that I think it's I don't know if it's Nietzsche or not, who he talks about this, but the kind of a slave morality is a kind of abdication or responsibility of the outcome. In the sense of like, oh no, I could just say whatever I want, or to like, I can just, and it actually relates to something, I forgot who said it, but I note about kind of getting gratified pleasure of an act of wrath, where you have no interest, like you don't care about the consequences of your action of wrath, where you're acting out in anger and wrath in particular. And you're getting pleasure. And Aquinas has this one of the notes of like, basically an outcome can add to the goodness or badness of an intention and an act by the outcome. And one of them is by the intensity of pleasure you get out of doing it. So if you get pleasure out of this statement of wrath, there's like this venom coming out of you. That's and saying, what do you mean? I just had to, someone had to said it. It was the right thing to say, you know, and not being aware where you just cause all this harm by doing it. It's a real abdication of responsibility what's going on there. This is the kind of slave morality or a kind of lack of nobility where you're not taking responsibility for the larger. I think you're saying it very well in the sense that like it's a massive misunderstanding about intention and object. You have an intention, but you have no like the object is actually completely absent. Like it's basically another way to talk about idea versus eidos. You're saying telos, but it's really idea versus eidos. You're completely ignorant of the larger eidos of what's going on here. And Aquinas' language about all this, remember, any good that's misordered is bad, is viceful as a result. So it could be, like example he uses is basically saying, in this sense, releases the idea of correction and condemnation, right? It's one of the examples of it. The same act of it, the same statement said in the right way, in the right time, is correcting in a way of care, but said in a different time in a wrong place, in a wrong way, it's condemning. That's being an example of it. And I had a note about that, and from Aristotle, the perfection of justice is the equitable. What that means is because universal law and rules cannot respond to the particular circumstances by its nature. You need a flexible ruler, right? Daniel, in language of a kind of emotional, basically a qualitative measure, right, of some kind. And the correct, basically, for that difference is a correction of error. That's that's what justice is perfection. So actually moments of like, I would actually argue things like forgiveness are examples of that. So when there's transgressions, but they're acknowledged and there is a real willingness to change, that willingness of forgiveness is an example of equanimity, in my opinion, or kind of being equitable in that case. And I say that just kind of parallel another thing Michelle's bringing up, right? This idea, because I actually had a note, I was going to bring it up and she beat me to it, right? This boundary stuff, it's actually for yourself. It is for yourself on two grounds on this. One is the idea, as Michelle actually example drew out, which is when people are making demands on you that are depleting, and you need some area of you need some sufficiency to exist, like to eat a meal and to get sleep, for example. It's actually in your own self, it's in self-respect that you create a kind of boundary by that reason. But a more kind of fundamental point I was going to add on to that is the fulfillment of one's word to oneself. So when you say, I'm going to do X, and then you fulfill it, you're actually giving, that is the foundation of self-confidence, of actually true self-respect, is in the fulfillment of one's word. And then actually, I was an expansion of that. It's the fulfillment of one's word to others. So when you say you're going to do X, and then you do X for someone, that is again, you're actually self-filling yourself. I always use that language of like selfless versus selfish. That being an example, I call self-full. You're actually filling yourself up with yourself full. You're not emptying it out in a way to destroying yourself, nor ignoring or being very selfish and kind of taking away from others. It's kind of a balancing act about it. And I say this because it relates actually, and Daniel noted about that kind of boundary making when it's actually difficult. It's because it's when you want to do the easy way out of not putting a boundary by not holding a rule set. That's an example of basically abdicating responsibility. And actually, especially with children. Hey, listen, and that actually relates to ADOS. Listen, children are developmentally diverse, as Michelle hinted at. They require the expectation. When is it reasonable to expect a child to wait versus when is it not reasonable? That answer changes based on circumstances and development of the child. So I think these are all equitable nature responses of when is it, like a baby crying because it put its hand on a stove. It's going to cause a very different response than your 9-year-old asking for their dessert. They can wait a minute. And actually, that's building up their temperance, by the way. But you see, actually, in all these things, because that's the question, like, well, how do you know? What's the quantification of when one rule gets ruled over the other? And actually, part of the answer is it's part of it's the priority chain of the nature of the relationship of the family. That's the answer to this question, right? You have to know these things. That's the way you answer these points. That's one last thread on this idea of intention, and Michelle drew, I think, is really good. I made a note with you, Daniel. We talked about this many, many moons ago in the net, right? That the emotion is actually an example of the outside reality, because emotions make no sense if there is not. It demonstrates the model of, at the minimum, the active inference model reference a schema of reality, which is their internal inference models in the mind, and there's an external reality that's being interfaced. And then that interface is what emotion is. The language is called synchronity of emotion. It's actually an example of that. So we talked this many moons ago, but that idea of when you're in tension, like with an emotional response, that's the point. There's a signal inference contrast or agreement, right? So that contrast of difference or agreement of similarity, consistency, is what it draws out emotion, and it's different arousal and valiance and all the other qualities of it. So I think that's actually, again, another argumentation of one direction about the external, that point. There's an external reality that, and as Daniel, I remember we talked about this it had to be 2 years ago, maybe 3, on the net, very early net, of beauty by the way we talk about it and surprise. having this quality of intention. And what does that mean? It means the external reality has intention. Wait a minute. Has a telos, has eidos and form, and has a strike on us when it contrasts to us. Interesting. Very interesting. I remember that many moons ago. So I'm reminded of those points. And that leads to the last note, right? Which is this idea of witnessing. I was actually going to put a chat in the chat box about that. Someone else was talking, but I forgot to, or I decided not to. I want to bring it up now. This idea of witnessing, of clear intention and awareness of the other. It's a very powerful detail because actually almost all knowledge requires it, because it means you're moving your, instead of the entire kind of, instead of that derpy state of just in your mind, and you're dealing with just this artificial, the kind of blindness to the external reality, you're actually being you're present and aware to what's in front of you. It's actually an incredible amount of energy required for that, right? Just from a pure like psychological, physical energy of intention, it actually requires a lot of you. So you're actually expending a lot to do this. But all knowledge kind of tends to require that. I just say it from teaching, because from teaching, on two sides of that. One, when I see students learning from observational drawing, they're almost always in the beginning looking at their ideas in their head, not the actual thing in front of them. So the training in the arts is to make you, force you to actually see what's in front of you, not the image, not the idea in your head instead. That's the first one. And the second one kind of related to it is great teachers are always aware in a double move, actually almost a three-part move. One, you have the project, like your course objectives. What has to be taught to the student? Number one. Then it's how is the populational room responding to this? What is the room population responding to it? And then there's the particular student responding to it, right? And then a great teacher responds to that. They're not going to just slam through the same presentation in the same way, and irrelevant of what population they're dealing with and what student they're dealing with. They're going to adjust and respond to the error. And a great teacher usually, actually, this is very much like parenting, it doesn't land, you don't get mad at the student. You have to respond to it. You have to go another direction. And it's kind of, again, the boulder versus riverbank response. When you have a flow, that's another note about constraints. One of the big differences, intention ideas especially, have no constraints. They're unlimited. They just fly through the air in a great space of unlimitedness. That's the big problem of human nature. We have the same power of the unlimited in thought that God has. But the problem is we're corporal beings. We can't handle that. Versus objects have constraints. They have flows, constraints, limitations, circumstances. And it's the conjunction of the two you need for humans. We need that. When we deal with children, that's the point. We love to be able to say, we're going to just be dictators and just stamp all over them. We don't do that. I've never seen parents actually work that way, especially when the child actually does not have reason, like you cannot reason with them. They're a force of nature now. They're not an object of reason. They're a force of nature. But in teaching, it's very similar. It's not that different, to be honest. So I think it's a really interesting nuances about the quality of emotion, and particularly about intention, act, will, and object, and how they're interacting with each other. And really, because remember, we said justice is one of the aspects that arouse anger. But one of the ways it's almost this virtue of equity, of the equitable is actually required. One of the ways to respond to it, to kind of alleviate and to address the error from basically a rule break, right? I think it's really interesting. That's all I got.
Magnificent. And I've really enjoyed this discussion, and thank you so much. You said a lot there that was fantastic. I think because we have unlimited thought in a limited reality, it is possible for this disorder of the good that leads to privation, because we can make unlimited things that ought not to be unlimited. Or we can make things limited in a way that they shouldn't be limited. Because if they're unlimited, we can also choose limits that are improper in that unlimitedness, right? So the very unlimitedness and limit is precisely what leads to the potential disordering of those bounded things in a manner that is not just teleologically fitting, and so on and so forth, right? And unfortunately, this would kind of suggest that the best thought is always going to be a movement of the unlimited into limitation, which may feel bad. So then we probably are prone to kind of think in a manner that keeps us in the unlimited, like good intention. Good intention is great because it doesn't have to, because it's unlimited. I'm basically taking a moral category that is not bound by the consequence.
So it's unlimited to unlimited, ergo cancerous, in that kind of Ebert sense, right? I love what Jason said about good intention being the participatory trophy. Exactly. I had a good intention. Yay, you get a trophy for participating. Great. That's cool. But there's something about thought wanting to create heuristics of its quality according to its very unlimitedness, because otherwise it would have to humble itself, reduce its power, reconciliate itself with determination, and that is traumatic, right? There's a certain trauma in that, but if you do philosophy regularly, you can be used to it, and so better able to do it, right? This is another thing where philosophy seems to have some sort of training of the natural mental health immunity, per se, natural mental health, right? Is that because you get used to needing to have the unlimited move into the limited. You get used to it. But if you don't do that, then it does feel kind of traumatic because you feel so powerful, and then you have to observe the situation. You feel like you can imagine anything. I'm on Mars, I have wings, but I have to look at this. You know, observation is limited if I'm looking at something in the way we're talking about versus imagination that is unlimited. So there's something that it's just like the very religious practices of wash the dishes. You don't want to be there. You don't want to stare at something. You want to do something, right? Like all of that suggests there's something about us that makes it really difficult to have the unlimited move to the limited, or the unlimited try to reconcile with the limited, or the unlimited trying to order the limited. And if you don't have regular practices of doing that, then when stuff hits the fan, you could be in trouble. And of course, there's a bad form of philosophy that simply plays around with the unlimited and hypothetical and trolley problems and all that nonsense. So therefore, it's a philosophy that doesn't lead to a habitus of the possible true infinity. Actually, it contributes to the spurious infinity that we are tempted by because it feels unlimited. But actually, it's just spurious. And that's where I think we get into a lot of trouble. I love also what you were saying about the fulfillment to your own word, that boundaries are supposed to be in service of that. I think that's exactly right. Like when you say, I'm going to do X, then you create boundaries of saying like no to stuff that takes you from that, right? But that's where business leaders and many people will say that a lot of maturity is the ability to say no, right? But notice, why is it hard to say no? Because you don't want to disappoint people, right? This is where the language of boundary is good, because it's hard on you. But people want to use boundaries in a manner that is not a fulfillment to a word, but a defense of the weaknesses of their personality. Like a lot of times people use boundaries to defend a privation in their personality they need to work on. They say, hey, this is my boundary. It's like, no, actually, we need to like break through that to force you to work on that, right? So people unfortunately use boundaries and no's to service sometimes the problematic dimensions of their personality, as opposed to learning the discipline of saying no when you don't want to maintain fulfillment to your word or the things you need to do, right? Like, why do people get overextended? Or why do people not have time management? Or why do people not accomplish their goals? Because they're not able to say no. They're not able to fulfill their words. Those are boundaries. But here's the key. When we but then that boundary, the better word for it is almost what? Discipline, commitment. It is a boundary that secondarily leads to, it's a commitment that secondarily leads to boundary. The boundary is not primary. But very often boundaries and relationships are actually primary. People, bam, this is the boundary. It's not a boundary that follows from a commitment or follows from your word. It's a boundary that's placed down so you can defend yourself from facing yourself. That's the problem. A lot of times people are using boundaries so they don't have to change something that's hard, right? But if it's a boundary that comes from a commitment and a discipline, well, then it is hard. So you're not using boundaries to defend yourself from hard. You're forcing yourself to, well, face yourself and tarry with the negative, right? So I think that's a critical distinction. I really like how you said that. I think also, like, yeah, so much, it's like quality, judgment, it all comes quality. And yeah, I think on the teleological stuff where people want to throw it out, because basically everything we're saying is suggesting that, well, reality has some sort of teleological structure to it, right? And I think emotions is a great example because emotion, right? It's got motion in it. Emotions in of themselves have a certain like a certain push to them, right? I think honestly, if you look at reality, it looks really teleological. And I think basically the mistake is people take a cup, they look at a cup, and they imagine a world where humans don't exist and there's a cup, and they say, look, it doesn't have a teleology. But that's an imagined hypothetical experiment. I need a world where the cup emerges without humans coming into existence, right? Like, it's a mistake to look at inanimate objects that only exist because humans made them, which, by the way, they made them for what? A purpose. And then to say, because that object does not in of itself, and I can imagine a world where that object is there and humans don't exist, therefore there's no teleology, right? That's imagination, just like intention. That's using your unlimited power to create a hypothetical universe where objects exist that would only exist because of humans, but humans don't exist, would never occur to thus say there is no such thing as teleology, right? Like, looks to me as if physics gives us chemistry, chemistry gives us biology, biology gives us mind, that there is some sort of, in the things themselves, emergent potential to give rise to something, right? Like Stuart Kaufman talks about the autocatalytic. Like, the only way you get life from a pure, just is that there's something like in chemistry that is autocatalytic, meaning it eventually becomes its own catalyst for generating life, right? This is very important. No one is saying, here's the key, that means in the object of chemistry itself is a biological telos. It is there in it, not an idea. In it is the boom. Now we have biology. Likewise, apparently in biology is what you need for the material of mind, right? In the thing. It is in there. Teleological, right? It doesn't have to be added. That's why it is here, right? And you see, the thing is, then everything mind generates like a cup. No one creates something to be thought about. Everyone creates something to be experienced. No one writes The Sound and the Fury for people to think about the Sound and the Fury. You write the Sound and the Fury to be experienced and then think about it, right? So every creative act is always primarily for an experience, which then generates ideas, but the experience is first, of which is inseparable from a teleology. But because you can then think about the thing you experience, you can confuse the image and idea with the teleology and say that's all it is. No one has ever made anything to be thought about. It is to be experienced and then thought about, right? So the very act of a human creation, distinct from a causal physical outcome, must be experiential. And the teleology is always experiential, and that's what people make. They do not make things to be thought about. They make things to be experienced, which is bound inevitably with a teleology that then can be thought of and misordered because of the unlimitedness of the mind. Because the mind is unlimited, it has the ability to make the mistake of confusing idea with telos, but that's only because you're capable in your very unlimitedness of making that disorder, which is then privational, right? Like, and again, we simply do not see, like, obviously there's a telos in biology. It's just primarily like survival. Like, animals naturally survive. They just in themselves do. It's not an idea. You see this. You see chemistry move toward autocatalytical outcomes. You see in physics, you see movements toward entropy that leads to negentropy because that's an efficient way to have the energy be used up, right? There is a movement of everything in itself towards certain things that are irreducible to the other emergent vectors, to use that language, but every emergent vector in of itself is full to the brim with telos in the things themselves, not the ideas of them. It's just that ideas are a way to condition or position ourselves relative to those things we can experience, so we can better align with the telos that is not self-evident in the experience of the thing, because it is the thing. So the moment you're trying to think the telos of a cup, you're reducing the cup to an idea, but the thing is the telos, dang it. The whole thing is the telos. So the moment you're thinking about it, which is a reductionist act, you lose the telos. You have to, but in losing it, you can negate it back into it. Negation of the negation, you then reconcile yourself with it, right? So you have to have the ideas to condition yourself with the experience in a manner that increases the probability of experiencing the telos. But that means the thinking is for the sake of positioning yourself to things, to experience them and align with their telos, not to determine their telos. You can never make a telos equal an idea, because ideas are the mental activities that position yourself to things to experience their telos in themselves as unfolding as themselves. And if one does this successfully, which has an alignment of situation, telos, and flow, evidence that one is doing this successfully is the experience of beauty. Because when beauty strikes forth, this gives one reason to think that they have so aligned themselves in a manner that is proper, because that's why they're having the strike of this beauty, because they used ideas in service of the telos to have this experience, which then does what? Emote them, gives them motion, gives them movement, gives them inspiration, and now we have a feedback loop. The movement of things is toward the place where they can have the experience that inspires them to move. And then we have a system that is its own dance and operation, and it finds its fittedness in that movement, which sounds like what? The ever creativity of relationship in God. We said that the point of a relationship is to have this ever creativity. If in fact things are themselves that of which move toward that of which moves them, then we are talking about reality as an ever interrelating situation of beauty and ever creativity, which does sound like a love that moves the sun and other stars and is a testament to that very love. And I do think this is the sort of metaphysical structure that one can arrive to if you follow the phenomenology of emotions and ask what must be the conditions of their possibility that are part of the world itself. I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much. May you have a wonderful day. Thank you all. All the best.